What's up, y'all? As always, welcome whenever and wherever you might be watching. I'm excited for tonight. I'm very excited for tonight. The theme is big lies, plural, big lies. This will become more apparent the longer the night goes on. If you're a former Adventist or if you've ever engaged with an Adventist at any length of time, you're going to know that one of the SDA Church's favorite slogans is that they are the commandment-keeping church, one of which is the ninth commandment. In case you have forgotten, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. I've said on this platform, and I will continue to, that when the SDA Church claims to be the commandment-keeping church, that is really a euphemism. We have talked about this before. If you've been here for any length of time, you know what that euphemism is. It is a euphemism for we go to church on Saturday. Because another thing I've constantly said, and will continue to say, is that the commandment-keeping church's favorite commandment to break is the ninth commandment. It is hard-coded into their system of theology where they constantly bear false witness about the Christian church, as well as those of us who have left their ranks. So tonight, we're going to be taking a look at a whole host of big lies that the SDA Church and her apologists have engaged in and the acts of damage control that they use to try and cover them up. With me to discuss this, who has also been a target, by the way, of some of these big lies, Dr. Steve Daly. For those that do not know, Dr. Daly is the author of 28 books. 10 of them are directly related to Ellen G. White and Adventism. He taught religion, history, and psychology at the university level with a 24-year tenure in Seventh-day Adventist institutions, including Loma Linda University and La Sierra University. During those years, he was also a campus chaplain and pastor. He has been licensed as a psychologist since 1992 with his PhD in psychology. He also holds an MA in history and a doctorate in religion from Claremont School of Theology, where his dissertation integrated history and religion related to Ellen White and Adventism. We are also going to be discussing some of the contents of his newest book, The White Estate Fraud, Seventh-day Adventism's Scandalous, Untold Story. In the synopsis of the book, the publisher writes this: "For years, dissenting voices have been silenced, their character tarnished, and critical information distorted. Daly sets the record straight, debunking the claims that D.M. Canright, the author whose book exposed the fraud within the church, had recanted. Drawing on meticulous research, Daly exposes the shocking inner workings of the SDA." So we're going to get into quite a bit tonight. First, we're going to start by interacting with some of the claims that SDA academics have made about Steve, as well as some of their defenses to some of the claims in his books, and let you, the viewer, see where the evidence stands. After that, we will then transition into the specifics of his book, which you can purchase on Amazon. A link to that is in the description box down below. No, it's not an affiliate link. I get nothing for it. I just support the book and think that you should too, because it is a treasure trove of information. But before bringing him in, I want to remind you that you can visit answeringadventism.com for more resources, to partner with us, sign up for our monthly newsletter, and so much more. This resource is our gift to you. It is packed with information. Please use it. Simply type in a name in this powerful search bar, a phrase, a subject, and click enter. And it'll take you to everything on the website within that category, topic, or that uses that word. You can use it for phrases, contradictions, names, Doug Batchelor, etc. And you can browse to your heart's desire. We receive a lot of questions via email, and it is hard to get back to all of them, which is in part why this website exists. So please check out the website first. You may be able to get an answer quicker that way. With that said, I want to get right into it here. Steve, thank you for being here, sir.
Hey, thanks so much, Miles, for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, like I mentioned, first I want to look at some statements from a couple of Adventist scholars about you, DM Canright, and those of us, I would be under this umbrella as well, that have been critical of their movement. Then I want to get into the big lies, plural, that you talk about in your book. So, first, in Dr. Jud Lake's book, I'm a former student of Dr. Lake, Ellen White Under Fire. He starts off by spending the first two chapters poisoning the well, basically, by claiming all critics of Ellen White are modern day DM Canright parrots. And as I'm sure you're aware, mentioning that name in Adventist circles is kind of like, just letting the bomb go off of just toxin, apostate, heretic, Archibald heretic. And he refers to him as the father of Ellen White criticism. This is a recurring theme from the SDA Church, for those that do not know, and her apologists still use this, as you're going to see multiple times this evening. But he goes into Canright's history to essentially say that he had a personal axe to grind with the church, and the fruit of that has been now a bunch of people in the modern day parroting his personal grievances and angst against Adventism. He at least had enough honesty to admit that the Review and Herald actually started all of that. Maybe we'll get into some of that later, but notice what he writes. He says, quote, Dudley M. Canright's departure from Seventh-day Adventism and his subsequent lengthy campaign to discredit its prophetic messenger can be considered a critical turning point in the history of Ellen White criticism for 4 reasons. These are the 4 reasons. First, in the culmination of his work, The Life of Mrs. E.G. White, he recycled the criticisms of Ellen White's prophetic ministry from 1845 to the late 1880s covered in the previous chapter. Second, he conceived new criticisms against her, such as the plagiarism and epilepsy charges. He was also the first one to systematically associate Ellen with cult leaders in the 18th and 19th centuries, such as Emanuel Swedenborg, Anne Lee Staley from the Shakers, Joseph Smith of the Mormons, Mary Baker Eddy of the Christian Scientists, and Charles T. Russell of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Third, Canright raised almost all the issues that would be directed against Ellen White in the future. Most of the criticisms circulating the internet today are recycled from Canright's complaints. Even when an occasional new criticism is posted, it still stands in the framework of his stratagem. Fourth, Canright provided a model that almost all future critics of Ellen White would copy. From the non-Adventist evangelical critics of the early 20th century to the former Adventist critics of today, that's us, most of them have followed the pattern he laid out in Life of Mrs. E.G. White and have considered this volume to be influential in their thinking. In this sense, therefore, Canright can be called the father of Ellen White criticisms. Close quote. So we will get into who DM Canright is in a little bit. But Steve, my question for you, is that true? Are your books, 28 of them, 10 of which have to do with, in this same vein, are your books criticizing Ellen White simply recycled claims that Canright made?
No, absolutely not. I would agree with Lake that, Canright was certainly one of the most influential early critics, but he certainly wasn't the first. Miles Grant was before Canright, and he, that's one reason I wrote my psychobiography, was to study the research question: will the accusations of fraud and pathology leveled against Ellen White throughout her lifetime and after her lifetime stand up to historical and psychological scrutiny? And so I went through all the critics. I looked at all of them, and Canright was certainly a very influential one, but I relied very little on him in my book. I think I quoted him once. So the notion that I simply parroted Canright, which is, there's a strategy here in Adventism. They feel like they have discredited Canright, which of course we know isn't true now, especially since the White Estate fraud has come out. It shows that they're the ones who discredited themselves, not Canright, and that Canright was actually a very great man of integrity and a humble man, a man who didn't have axe to grind against Adventism and actually wanted to have a very peaceful truce. And it was the Adventists who insisted on breaking that in the Review and Herald repeatedly before Canright decided to defend himself. But, I can't say that I'm very impressed with Lake. I wish he would have come on and debated me, because I find his arguments to be very weak and unscholarly. And, I think he just falls into the same category that the apologists, who even call themselves scholars, fall into, which is they don't seriously address the source documentation in my psychobiography. Not a single one of them has done that. I had top EGW scholars on my reading committee for the psychobiography. I had 21 people on there, including Ron Numbers, Jonathan Butler, Ron Grable, Gil Valentine. They were all on there, and not a single one of them questioned or challenged my source documentation in the book. So that's not surprising that Tim and Jud Lake and these other people aren't doing it, and certainly not any of the other critics that come on my thread on a daily basis. They never address the source documentation of Ellen White's own words, her own actions, her lifetime patterns. That's what my conclusions are based on. And I looked at all the critics in the process of doing that. And Canright is certainly a noteworthy one. But the reason Adventists love to hold up Canright and say we're all copycats of Canright is because they have this false narrative that they've discredited Canright, and that's absolutely untrue. And that's why I wrote this last book, to show it's absolutely untrue. And they're guilty of not only, gross dishonesty, but when you absolutely fabricate a book and claim to be a man's secretary and try to destroy him with his own diaries after he's dead, when you never even met the man. And Arthur White colluded with this for 20 years secretly, denying it on top of that. I mean, you're talking about some extreme pathology here that is really ugly. And Adventists are trying to defend that. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, and so the thing that we're going to get into a bunch of that, by the way, folks, in a lot more detail. The thing that really bothers me about Dr. Lake's book, I like Dr. Lake. Like I said, I'm a former student of his. Nice guy, but man, his criticisms are just, sorry, man. They don't cut it. They don't actually, like you mentioned. There's zero engagement with the actual claims. The only engagement I've ever found around the real issues is omitting certain details. Like, oh, we're not going to talk about the fact that in that first vision, she's literally just plagiarizing Joseph Turner's paper.
Right.
That she claims she was getting a headache when she would read, so she didn't see it, even though she was left alone with the paper, and just happened to, the thing he talked about at the meeting that she wasn't able to go to because she didn't feel good. It just happened to be what she saw in vision. She was alone with the paper, but didn't look at the paper. She knew nothing about it. They're not addressing that.
Joseph Turner said that was exactly what he'd said.
Right. And even Roger Olson in his, I was somewhat impressed, at least, by the fact that he did a big write-up. I don't know if you've seen it on the White Estates website. It was probably posted somewhere else back in the day and then just transcribed to digital. But I was at least somewhat impressed with the fact that he tried to deal with the shut door problem. He didn't touch that. We went over it months ago on the channel. We went over this whole issue, and we looked at his write-up, and he completely dodges all of the actual issues. He loves the later quotes. I never claimed, I never said, one word in what, 71 or whenever it was. I never claimed it. Yeah, in 84 or whatever it was. I never claimed this. Well, you either have a terrible memory or you're just lying, because you did, and it's documented. The thing that bothers me, though, about Lake's book is that he really just engages in the genetic fallacy instead of actual criticism. It's irrelevant if Canright was the first or 200th person to point these things out. That has no bearing on whether or not it's true. And he never really addresses the criticisms throughout the book. He simply claims Canright misunderstood Ellen's role, had a faulty, what he calls a rigid view of inspiration. That's the term he uses over and over. They have this real rigid view of inspiration, aka God should be able to communicate effectively. But he really actually he never actually deals with the substance of the claims. Canright had zero bearing on me leaving the SDA Church. I've talked about this a lot. I wasn't even aware of him until many years after leaving Adventism. If anything, the Protestant reformers had far more influence on me leaving Adventism than any sort of former Adventist. I didn't even really grow up hearing about Canright other than the sort of vague references to, the apostates and the critics, etc. But it's also an interesting insight for people to see how Adventists are quick to associate all the other sects that rose up in the same time period as cults, but not Seventh-day Adventism. They get a pass for some reason. Because he says, Canright's the originator of pointing out, that Ellen White's no different than Ann Lee of the Shakers and all these other figures. And there's sort of this undertone, which I'm sure you saw that being an SDA academic. They're quick to say, oh yeah, all these other groups, they're cults, but we're not.
Right.
So you get the undertones of that in his book.
Precisely.
In a few weeks, I'll be doing a fuller response to Dr. Lake's book, as well as a talk that he gave regarding this. But that's point one. The SDA Church, folks, loves making the claim that anyone who is critical of them and their errant theology is just a parrot of Canright, which is the SDA Church essentially postulating that they've dealt with all those criticisms before. There's nothing new under the sun. Don't even listen to what they're saying. That's the sort of messaging.
That's precisely.
Because Steve, now I want to get your thoughts on some claims made by the Associate Director of the Adventist Biblical Research Institute, Alberto Tim, who is also the former Associate Director of the White Estate. He had quite a bit to say about you by name and your previous book, Ellen White, A Psychobiography, in an article from May 2021 that was titled Steve Daly on Ellen White. And I've heard you talk a lot on a number of, the Christian Scholars Forum, on Peter Dixon's SDA Q&A. We're going to play a clip from that later, actually. And after reading this article, I remember thinking to myself, that doesn't sound like what Steve is actually saying. This sounds like the standard MO. So I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on some of these. I want to look at a number of claims that he makes about you. The first is with regards to your positive statements about Ellen White, apparently from many moons ago, and then your subsequent criticisms that have come later on. So notice what he writes. He says, quote, "How can we explain the contrast between Daly's previous pro-Ellen White position and his present anti-Ellen White stand? Daly points to the publication on the internet of new material I have found from suppressed areas of the White Estate vault, which I wasn't even allowed to see as a historian," he says. He even suggests the evidence used to support the validity of these criticisms was very convincing then, when White was still alive, and is even more overwhelmingly today, given the new research that has come to light. But this question requires a more convincing answer than just access to new historical information. White's unpublished writings, to which he refers, have been available for study by historians and researchers at E.G. White Estate Research Centers, including the White Estate Branch Office at Loma Linda University, long before they were made available publicly on the internet. Further, the major criticisms against White, D.M. Canright, Ronald Numbers, Walter Ray, and a few others were already available when Daly published his Adventism for a New Generation in 1993, several of which he had cited in his MA thesis, How Readest Thou? Could it be that what really happened was a radical change in his own perspective, in which all the critics of White became reliable sources of information, and all Adventist responses to those critics were discarded as unreliable excuses? Close quote. So, Steve, he claims that you seemed to praise Ellen White at one point, but then began siding with all of the known critics as reliable sources of information while discarding and ignoring Adventist responses to those critics. Is this hypothesis correct?
Absolutely not. Tim really disappoints me. I don't know if he's deliberately dishonest or if he's just not very sophisticated in terms of understanding research, but the bottom line is that when you do research, you have a research question and you explore that question. That's what I did when I wrote my MA thesis on the 1919 Bible Conference. That's what I did when I wrote The Irony of Adventism on Ellen White at Claremont. I was looking at the paradox between Ellen White being a female leader and how Adventist women were treated in general in the church and even by her. And, my PhD in psychology, again, was on Adventism, Adventist adolescence and addiction, a very specific question. When you do research, you don't cover the waterfront. If a person's claiming to write a biography on a figure, then you're expected to look at all sides, which of course Adventists have totally failed to do with regard to Ellen White. Every single biographer has completely failed to look at the dark side of Ellen White, to look at the immorality, to look at the lifelong patterns of dishonesty. There's a huge amount of stuff there that a biographer is obligated to look at if they're going to write a biography of a person. I was not writing a biography of Ellen White. I made that very clear in the psychobiography. Psychobiographies can focus specifically on pathology. There's a wide spectrum of things that psychobiologies can focus on. I gave my research question very specifically that I already mentioned. Will the accusations, the many accusations of fraud and pathology leveled against Ellen White, both during and after her lifetime, will they stand up to historical and psychological scrutiny? I think I'm about the only Adventist critic who has the historical credentials and the psychological credentials to address that question. And I've addressed it very specifically. The notion that I need to be including all kinds of garbage that Tim wants me to include in that book is just nonsense. It shows that he doesn't understand research. He doesn't understand a research question. He doesn't understand what a psychobiography is. All that stuff was explained in my book. I can only assume that he didn't read the book or that he doesn't grasp things very well. But, it's just really sad that he makes all these accusations while he, goes off on the self-righteous trip about how we need to be so careful about judging people's motives. And then in his book review of my psychobiography, he goes, right after saying that, judges my motives in one context after another. That's just absolutely humorous. I don't know if he's trying to be a comedian or, and he's not a valid scholar, because when I tried to respond to his book review, it wasn't allowed. The White Estate wouldn't allow me to respond, just like Spectrum would not allow me to respond to Jonathan Butler's review. So I put appendixes in both of those reviews in the White Estate Fraud. Appendix 3 and 4 are my responses to Butler and to Tim, because they're very easy to respond to. And I think the reason Spectrum didn't want to publish it is because it made Butler look so embarrassed. It basically just embarrassed him. I went point by point through his review and just took it apart. And I did the same thing with Tim. I mean, these people are ad hominem attacks. That's all it is. They don't look at the research. They don't look at the source documentation. They don't look at the lifelong patterns that Ellen White reveals herself. It's not me just making accusations against her. It's herself saying these things. She's the one that says in 1849, sell your homes. God has shown me to sell your homes and give the money to the cause, which her and James controlled. Her and James became wealthy from that money. They never attempted to sell or downsize their own home for the next 7 years, as she was repeatedly making this call to church members, it's just gross exploitation. I mean, the stuff she was doing, any person who would look at it objectively would say, holy Toledo, this woman is evil. And for these scholars to try to act like they're objective researchers when they just ignore all this evidence that's so damning, to me, just disqualifies them as scholars. They're not scholars at all. They're simply pretenders. They want to keep their status.
Folks, if you've seen the Ellen White funeral stream that we did from some months back, I think it's almost up to 15,000 views. You know that what Steve is saying here, we've looked at these quotes directly. We've shown that they've never addressed this problem. That is exactly what she did. We're going to be rehashing this quote again on Monday when we talk about the 144,000. But this idea of sell your homes, Christ is coming back, you're not going to need any of that stuff, give it to the church, so it can be used to further the cause. Yet they never did that.
Right.
They reaped the benefits of it, and they got a big windfall out of it. So we'll be getting back into that on Monday as well. Now, his next claim is a little bit long, but it's all in the same vein of the single charge he's making. So I'll read it all, and then I want to get your thoughts. For those that want to read it for themselves, by the way, all of these quotes, the link to this is in the description box down below. So if you want, you can follow along that way. But notice what he says. He says, quote, "The author, talking about you, claims to have used 325 references. Mr. Tim, it's actually 326 throughout his book. Such a prolific number can be a strength if the presuppositions are well in place and the sources fairly reflect the available data. Otherwise, get this, it becomes just another way of impressing the not so well-informed reader. Unfortunately, Douty is very selective in the use of sources, placing much emphasis on those that confirm his views and simply ignoring those that disagree with him. For example, Francis D. Nichol, their favorite hero, Francis D. Nichol's classic Ellen G. White and Her Critics is referred to just once, but as a famous apologist work with biased information. Several more recent books that respond to the very same issues raised by Douty are not even critically mentioned. The insightful Ellen G. White Issues Symposium series, published yearly since 2005 by the Center for Adventist Research at Andrews University, is completely ignored. More surprising is the fact that the outstanding Ellen G. White Encyclopedia from 2013, considered the most important reference work produced by the Seventh-day Adventist Church in a half century, is mentioned just once amongst other sources in an endnote. One would not expect Douty to quote all these sources or to necessarily agree with their perspectives, but to simply ignore them throughout the book suggests a bias, especially from someone who considers himself a specialist in Ellen White. Similar omissions with inaccuracies can be detected in the way Steve Douty handles primary sources. For example, after suggesting that White fled to Australia largely because of her problems with plagiarism, he states that on March 20, 1889, the first public charge or accusation of plagiarism against Ellen White to appear in the press was published in the Harrodsburg Enterprise, and that it was a 5-page article. Douty refers to this as the first public charge without mentioning that it was D.M. Canright who was the mentor of all of these charges, which he had already raised in his lectures in the Truett's Theater, Healdsburg, California in 1889, and which were already being advocated by him and the Pastors Union of Healdsburg in that newspaper. The March 20 article was merely another short article signed by the Pastors Union. And more, how could that 2-column article become a 5-page article if the newspaper had only 4 pages? Nor should we overlook the fact that almost 2 years earlier in 1887, Canright had already raised similar public accusations in the Michigan Christian Advocate. This lack of historical precision and historical reliability clouds much of Douty's research. Close quote. So again, I know that was a lot, but Steve, According to the Associate Director of the Adventist Biblical Research Institute, you are a remedial historian who omits and selectively cites sources with bias. Your astronomical amount of citations in the Ellen G. White psychobiography, not going to actually address any of those. They're only convincing for the ignorant and uninformed. And like Jud Lake asserted, you are a Canright parrot, but don't actually give him credit for it. So besides the massive case of projection coming from Mr. Tim regarding selectively citing sources, how accurate is that charge?
Again, it overlaps with what I just said. When a person isn't intelligent enough to understand what a research question is that's specifically described in a book and followed to a T, and then he criticizes me for not quoting the encyclopedia enough, not referring to the symposium, all those things are irrelevant to my research question. It's like, this guy's not very bright. Does he not understand what my research question was? Does he not understand that I followed that research question to a T? He tries to use one source, and by that one reference, tries to discredit all my references. And what he's doing there is he's straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. First of all, he's making a false claim that Canright somehow planted this story in the newspaper. You know, this is a secular newspaper. My point was, this was the first time a secular newspaper came out and took the position that Ellen White was a plagiarist. And it was a 5-part article. It was in 5 different newspapers over 5 weeks. I meant to say 5-part article, and it went in 5-page article. And that kind of thing doesn't get caught easily by, editors and stuff. So it was a 5-part article that stretched over 5 issues of the Hillsburg Enterprise. And there were 2 of them in February and 3 of them consecutively in March. And, what he's trying to do there is nitpick on a word, basically, and then try to discredit all my research in the book based on that one stupid point. It's called straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. And while he's doing it, he's misrepresenting the newspaper. They vetted that story. There was a whole group of ministers who'd been hearing Canright and believed and accepted what he said. And the newspaper not only acknowledged that they recognized that Ellen White was a plagiarist, but the newspaper itself was taking the position that Ellen White was a plagiarist. And Tim seems to want to give the impression that the newspaper didn't vet this at all. They just let Canright come in and write his own story in the paper or something. It's absolute nonsense. Plus, when we recognize that it's 100% true, that she was a plagiarist, and they gave examples of it in the stories, I just have very little patience for the kind of dishonesty that Tim is doing there. I would love to debate Tim anytime in an objective environment with a neutral moderator, because the guy clearly doesn't know his stuff. He acts like I should be talking about F.D. Nichol all the time. F.D. Nichol was a farce. F.D. Nichol was the apologist of all apologists. F.D. Nichol was completely dishonest in how he covered the shut door issues, as we were talking about earlier. He takes her later statements and makes a big deal of them as if the secondary statements that come in 73 and 84 are more valid than the actual statement she makes between 1844 and 1851. This is just absolute nonsense. And, Nichol was a smart guy. I'll give him credit for that. He was a lot smarter than Arthur White, and he mentored Arthur White. But Arthur White was never a student. He was never a historian. He was a pretender all the way. Nichol was a smart guy. He was involved with the debates in the 1920s on creation and evolution, and presented himself quite well. He became the young superstar of Adventism. And then he became the ultimate apologist, the ultimate answer man for anyone who ever dared to criticize Ellen White. But he's dishonest. He's like a very smart lawyer who knows how to twist things and deceive people. Lawyers are paid, they're expected to do everything they can to win a case for their client. But researchers are not expected to do that. They're not expected to twist the evidence. They're not expected to leave out the most important source documentation while you take later statements that are the exact opposite of what the original statements were, and you try to build your whole case on the later statements. It's just irresponsible and it's incompetent. So I don't want to spend a bunch of time with Nichol when he's already discredited himself on the most important issue, really, which was the shut door. And he wrote hundreds of pages. I mean, it's not like he addressed this in a few pages. It was more than 100 pages in his 3 major apologetic works, where he just went into this shut door thing in immense detail, leaving out all the most important quotes. I mean, how stupid can you be? That's just, it's really difficult to tolerate. And Tim doesn't seem to know any better. He's, it's just sad that he's of course, the White estate, who takes it seriously? They've always been the ultimate apologetic body. And that's all Tim is, an apologist. Yeah. I would expect more from a Butler. That's why I was more disappointed by his book review, because he should know better, Right. But I don't take someone like Tim very seriously, or the White estate very seriously.
Well, it's interesting because you point out something that I think is a common problem that I even see in my videos from what you'd consider Adventist laity, at least based on their comments. And that is that SDAs will often comment on my videos, something that has nothing to do with the topic of the video, and ask, well, why didn't you address this?
Right.
Well, because videos, especially in content creation world, and this is typically in short format content, because we do long format content on this platform as well. But on the short format content, there's a thesis behind the video. It's to address a specific point. It's not to address everything, every possible thing you could possibly answer.
For sure.
It's a specific point, but they love to ignore that point and say, well, over here, you didn't address this. And FD Nichol is, even to this day, as I'm sure you're aware, he's their go-to guy.
Right.
They loved it, especially when it comes to the Ellen White racism, for example, which we're going to look at some comments regarding FD Nichol later. But Steve, he continues. He also mentions your charge regarding Ellen White's plagiarism, as they love to try and frame it. Her thought gems or literary borrowing, that's the term Jud Lake likes to use in his book, to kind of soften this idea that, no, you're stealing. You're stealing. Yes. It doesn't matter if it was legal at the time, if it was illegal. That's always a fun thing to get into with him. So God's law, which you guys are champions of, it only is really relevant if the American government recognizes when it is correct. Because if it doesn't transcend that, well, then what Ellen White did, regardless of whether it was legal or common or not, was still theft. But notice what he says here. He continues, and he says, quote, "One of the most recurrent themes of the book is White as a plagiarist. After qualifying her as the most successful plagiarist and con artist of all time, he asserts the reality was that if proper attribution had occurred, there would have been nothing significant contributed by the author. Ellen was taking virtually all of her history, theology, thoughts, and other content from other authors without attribution. For the sake of record, in 1986, the Ellen G. White estate produced an important document entitled Ellen White's Literary Sources, How Much Borrowing Is There? This document has been updated over the years to reflect known literary borrowings by White, identified by both her supporters and her critics. This document demonstrates a much lower percentage of borrowing than Steve Daly claims. His conclusions do not reflect the latest available research on the question." Close quote. So, Steve, now he claims your charges of plagiarism have already been dealt with by the White estate, an obviously unbiased source, of course.
Yes.
And that document proves that your claims are blown out of proportion. Is this true?
It's funny because Warren Johns worked for the White estate. He was one of their attorneys, and he said she plagiarized everything in every book. I mean, he was quoted as saying her plagiarism is so extensive that he's not aware of any book where it wasn't prolific. And I think Olson and Grable and they were a little more honest. Tim seems to be back in the old school of Arthur White or something. But all we have to do is look at the Veltman study. That's the most concentrated study of a relatively small amount of material over 8 years. He was paid by the church to do it. I know Veltman well. He was one of my professors when I was at PUC, and I was amazed the church chose him because this guy is a man of integrity, and you never expect the church to choose a man of integrity to do something like that. And of course, they didn't like his conclusions. That's why the study wasn't given out to the church. It was just summarized in Ministry Magazine after 8 years of a lot of money and a lot of time and energy. But what does Veltman say? He says 31% of what he studied could be directly tied to plagiarism, directly tied to copying specifically from other authors. And he said, of course, we didn't have unlimited resources, so there could have been an awful lot of resources that we weren't aware of that she copied from. But 31% significant. But the two much more important things that he concluded, which Tim never mentions, of course, he doesn't even mention Veltman here. But, number one, Veltman concluded that her work was derivative, not original. This was a general description of her stuff. It was derivative, not from God, but from other authors. So even though she didn't word for word copy a lot of things, we know that she got her outlines, her subtitles, titles, her themes. All these were taken from other books. She was not an original thinker. She wants to give the impression that God's giving her all this stuff, but we know that wasn't the case. And Veltman even has a more sobering conclusion, which troubled him more than anything else, was her immorality implied in what she did, that she deliberately hid these things, this copying and plagiarism, from her assistants. She tried to disguise it in her manuscripts. And, as Fanny and Marion found out more and more what was really going on, they were absolutely horrified that they were being made party to this kind of illegal, unethical, immoral behavior. And this is a prophet, supposedly a prophet of God, doing all this stuff. It's really sad. I didn't really answer the other question about my earlier statements. I was never a big Ellen White fan, even when I was a kid. My dad said, don't take her stuff too seriously. She says a lot of things where she didn't know what she was talking about. So he was kind of a man ahead of his time, but he wasn't a theologian or anything. So he was a very critical thinker and smart person. And so he did at least plant the idea in my head of testing her stuff when I was young. And then, when I went into the Adventist ministry, I did so to try to change the church, move the church in a much more healthy direction for its young people. That was my goal. But, the more I studied and learned about Ellen White, where I became a historian and really looked at things in detail, and started teaching Adventist history, I recognized that this woman had a lot of problems, but I didn't really conclude that she was a absolute false prophet until I wrote my books, The Prophetic Rift 1 and 2. And I was still in Adventism at the time, and I knew I wouldn't be in Adventism long after writing those books. But those were written in 208 and 209. But I was teaching in my Adventist history classes even through the 90s about the shut door and Ellen White's flip-flops on the shut door. And so before I really got into the shut door, I was inclined to give Ellen the benefit of the doubt. But once I became aware of her dishonesty with regard to the shut door, I never quoted her. And I was never like Ray. I was never a Ellen White fan. I never used her in my sermons or based my sermons on her or anything like that. So, it's just a basic evolution of study and thought and recognition over the years, more and more and more, that Ellen White had more and more and more problems. But it wasn't until I examined the specific research question about her pathology and her fraud with all the critics that I really became deeply aware of how sick this woman was. That's when I decided to write the psychobiography, as I saw the evidence that, holy Toledo, this is not a well woman. This is a woman who's a sociopath. And very specifically, without diagnosing her, just looking at the historical evidence and comparing it to diagnostic criteria, she's a high-functioning sociopath and a narcissist and a number of things. And, I'm the first psychologist to study her as a historian and conclude about her mental illness and stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like in my experience in Adventism, and maybe this was the same for you, I felt like there was a really big negative emphasis on critical thinking.
Absolutely.
And sort of, or I guess compartmentalized critical thinking.
Yeah.
You're only allowed to critically think in certain areas. And he makes this claim, that they've made for I don't know how long now. And they still make it to this day. Their apologists still make it to this day. We've dealt with all those criticisms. It's already all been dealt with way back when.
Yeah.
Don't even listen to these people. That's the sort of mentality.
Yeah.
But when you go check out what it is they're claiming, which it's almost a sense of irony because there's a lot of projection going on here, as we're going to see a little bit later, folks. I don't think they've actually read the critics as well as they want us to read the pro-apologists like F.D. Nichol. Because when you go and actually check out the things that they're claiming that have silenced all of this stuff, it doesn't deal with the issues.
Absolutely.
Like I said, I'm back in Jud Lake's book here recently, prepping for some content and revisiting this. And I'm just reminded of how the claim is, this has already been dealt with. This has all been dealt with, etc. No, it hasn't. Because when you go to these works, they're not even dealing with the primary issue. They're obfuscating to some other thing. They're saying, well, no, over here. You hear the classic, well, she said this over here, and look how flowery and uplifting it is.
Yeah.
Well, so did Joseph Smith. So
That's
does
what
the
a good sociopath does.
Yeah. So does the parking lot prophet down at the local church who had whatever to say. That has no bearing on the fact that she claimed, for example, this is just one of many, like you mentioned earlier, over 7 times she claimed to be shown the day and the hour of Christ's return. Why is God such a lousy communicator?
Yeah.
Hello? She's claiming this came from God. She's claiming that God told her the day and the hour. The defense I've heard recently, Steve, is no. After she said that, she claimed that she didn't actually remember the day and the hour.
Yeah, right.
So God wanted to tell her the day and the hour, but he's omniscient and knew that she wasn't going to remember the day and the hour. And she was going to go tell a bunch of people she knew the day and the hour, but didn't remember the day and the hour. In the vision, she writes that she was given the day and the hour, but then she later said, it's terrible defenses. It doesn't actually deal with the actual issue. But later in the paper, this is now what he asserts. This is his next claim about you. He says, quote, the issues raised by Daly in his book, and here he's speaking about your Ellen White psychobiography, are not new and have been addressed in previous publications. Even so, it might be interesting to more closely compare the out of Adventism spiritual journeys of both Canright and Daly, paralleling Canright's The Life of Ellen G. White from 1919 and Daly's Ellen White, a Psychobiography, and exploring their levels of historical reliability and rhetorical techniques. But such assessments should always be ethically and legally responsible. The irony. Taking into consideration Christ's warning against judging the inner motives of others. Matthew 7:1. Close quote. So
Yeah.
after doing the exact thing that he warns against here, judging the inner motives of someone, he claims that all your objections in all of your books are recycled, nothing new, and again makes a parallel to you and Canright, giving the undertones that you're simply a Canright parrot. Steve,
Yeah.
how accurate is this?
Again, it just speaks for itself that this guy doesn't even have good reasoning powers, much less scholarly understanding. I really feel sorry for him that he's embarrassing himself, because when you don't even understand what a research question is and you go off the way he has, failing to recognize that I followed my research question to a T, you just come out looking like a fool. I mean, any researcher, as a licensed psychologist, I was trained in research and research methods and statistics and these kinds of things at great depth, much more so than this guy has any clue about. And yet he's trying to criticize my research. I'll be glad to put up my academic research against whatever he's done anytime, anywhere. Tim is just what you would expect from the White estate. That's about all I can say. The White estate is the ultimate apologetic entity, and their whole purpose is to defend and to perpetuate Ellen. And so there's no objectivity there. For him to try to challenge my objectivity, I have no axe to grind. I didn't leave Adventism angry. I enjoyed my years in Adventism. It was a great part of my life. I enjoyed it more when I left Adventism and went to work for UCLA and got out of the Adventist subculture in the ghetto. But I didn't have any kind of axe to grind against Adventism. Like any Adventist employee, they tried to control me, and that's just the whole reason that they use this argument that we've dealt with all this stuff. This is old garbage. They're appealing to the authoritarian mentality in Adventism. Adventism attracts people who are conformists. It attracts people who lend themselves to an authoritarian personality. And that's exactly what they're exploiting and taking advantage of here. Oh, we're the authority figures, and we're going to assure you that there's nothing new, nothing to see here. Don't mind that person behind the curtain there. It's all just completely obvious what they're doing. And they're running into more and more problems because of the internet. More and more people are able to run down more and more information, and the church is in trouble. Their old methods are not going to continue to stand up, and the younger generation's not buying it, and they've got a lot of problems on their plate, and so they want to scapegoat someone like me by ad hominem attacks, but it's just absolute nonsense.
Well, Steve, the reason there's a lot of claims he makes in this paper. I only picked about 7 of them or so. And the reason that one stuck out to me is because just before this statement in the paper, we shouldn't judge the motives of another individual, Matthew 7:1, insert the proof text in there. He recognizes your stated position for writing your book. And notice what he claims. Quote, in his book, Ellen G. White, A Psychobiography, Daly leaves aside both the reliability of a historian and the ethical stand of a psychologist. to become utterly judgmental of the already long deceased White. Reading this book, the most natural assumption would be that it was produced out of spite or bitterness against the Adventist Church, even though the author emphatically denies it. Yet, such a denial becomes doubtful in light of the repeated and strong anti-Ellen White and anti-Adventism spirit that permeates the whole book. It is noteworthy that the author even subtly tries to transfer to God his own responsibility for the publication of his book. He says, I've prayed that if my own attempt at psychobiography provides in this book, I have prayed that if my own attempt at psychobiography provides in this book will do more harm than good, God will not allow it to be completed or published. So the reader is induced to believe that since God did not stop its publication, he actually approves of it. Close quote. That sounds to me like judging the inner motives of an other.
Absolutely.
Despite his own
motives all over the place there.
Despite his claim to the contrary and warning against such.
Yes.
And apparently, one isn't allowed to critically examine Ellen White because she's deceased.
And
But
one
Steve-
can't pray over writing a book of this kind of a serious nature because that's gross manipulation of people. I mean, when you start criticizing a person's prayers, I think it's just pure projection. The White estate knows the kind of manipulation they engage in constantly with church members, so they're simply projecting that onto me. But well,
that leads perfectly to my question with that quote, which is that what you meant in the book? Because I have the book, I've read the book, and I know what he's referencing. Is that what you meant when you said you prayed over writing the book?
No, I'm just simply saying this was a serious topic, so I prayed over it. It's that simple. I mean, I didn't want the book published if God didn't want it published. I'm agreeing with God, Lord. I don't want this book to be published. This isn't for my ego. I don't make money off my books, despite all the false accusations of Adventists who don't know what they're talking about. I simply want to pursue truth. I'm trying to present truth as best I can. If I'm somehow deluded or am not seeing truth as I think I am, I want you to intervene so the book doesn't do harm. I mean, it's just a serious, honest prayer. To criticize a person's prayer life when you're talking about not judging motives is about as revolting as you can get. This guy, he just repeatedly makes false accusations. He started out his book review by saying I was fired when I wasn't fired. I mean, the guy makes no attempt to do any kind of research before he makes statements, while he's self-righteously acting like he doesn't judge and he doesn't try to determine people's motives, and then he does the exact opposite of what he's warning against. So I really have very little respect for him. It's so funny that he's talking about ethics and morality when he's with the White estate that's been shown to be absolutely thieves, liars, cover-ups for Arthur White. I mean, this guy needs to be talking about what the White estate's going to do now that the evidence is out on Arthur White. What are they going to do about that? What are they going to do about the 6 volumes of Ellen White's life that were written by a man who was an absolute thief and liar and hid his role in creating this fabrication, which he knew was a fabrication? I mean, the White estate is so implicated in this that this guy should spend all of his time just trying to figure out what to say to that rather than making up lies about me.
Yeah, I'll tell you what they're going to do. They're going to get their shovels. They're going to dig a big hole and try and bury that with the same tactic and method that they've used for I don't know how long. But the thing they don't understand, and folks, I've brought this up many times on this channel, their old tactics are not going to work anymore.
Right.
This isn't 1980. anymore. This
Yep.
is a different era. So if you're just joining me, folks, I have Steve Daly here. Steve is a former professor in SDA institutions. He has his doctorate in psychology. He left the SDA Church some years ago, and we are discussing a number of claims that the SDA Church, by way of her scholars, have made about her. And we are going to be transitioning here shortly into some of the claims from his book after we address their sort of defenses to a number of those claims. So, Steve, I got one more here. He concludes his article by saying this, quote, "Throughout the book," again referring to your psychobiography of Ellen White, "there is a pervasive negative and even destructive spirit towards White that is voiced in a rather tendentious and biased manner. Even conflicting ideas and concepts should be discussed without becoming so judgmental. Unfortunately, that is not the case in this book. Furthermore, there is a repeated pattern discernible where historical evidence is not accurately dealt with, or opposing position or opinions and alternative interpretations are not fairly presented or even listed. This is not good scholarship and puts a dark shadow over the credibility of the entire book. In this sense, the book by Steve Daly reflects not the truth about Ellen White, but rather the truthiness of his thinking." Close quote. That's what he concludes his article with. So this is their standard hit and run method to detour Adventists from even considering reading your books.
Yeah.
The same sort of spirit and tactic that they've manifested from the days of Canright, a form of poisoning the well, if you will. He ends up reiterating that your scholarship is not good and it casts a dark shadow over your credibility. So what would you like to say in response to that before we get into exploring the big lies that you talk about in your book?
Again, I would just say I'm glad to put my works and particularly my academic works up against his any time, and we'll see who's the scholar. We'll see who's the researcher. We'll see who's objective and who isn't. He is basically just echoing what he wrote in the book review there. That's the exact same way he ended the book review and stuff. But when you don't allow a fellow scholar, if he's calling himself a scholar, if you don't allow someone to respond to a book review you write, that's not scholarship. That's just censorship. It's a complete inability to be fair, and anything else he says, amounts to a hill of beans, because he won't even allow me to respond to a book review he writes about my book. I mean, that's just completely ridiculous. And it's typical of the White estate. They don't want anyone to read anything that could possibly interfere with their propaganda. They're nothing but a propaganda machine. And Tim is nothing but a propagandist. He's not a scholar. He's not... he won't come on and debate me because he knows he doesn't stand a chance. The bottom line is that this hit and run approach of just using ad hominem attacks that are completely untrue, not addressing the evidence, it's just one thing after the next that is an embarrassment to these people, but all they're trying to do is deceive the masses, to continue to deceive the masses. They don't care what methods they have to use to deceive the masses. They just want to deceive as much of the massive SDA audience that they possibly can. And they'll use any lie to do it. They'll use any, all we have to do is look at Arthur White. Look at what he did with Carrie Johnson to perpetuate the myth and lie of Ellen White. I mean, you can't get any lower than that, to completely fabricate a book, claim to be someone's secretary when you never met them. Arthur White knew the whole thing. That's why it took him 20 years, because more and more, he found out more and more that Carrie Johnson was just a pathological serial liar. That's all she was. And so he was so invested in wanting to get the goods on Canright that he became the same kind of serial liar and deceiver and thief that she was. And, you don't become that. You either are that or you're not. So he was that. He fell from the same tree that Ellen White was from. And they were both extremely dishonest, deceitful people. And the White estate in general falls into that category. They're covering up, they're liars, they're do and say anything to deceive the masses about Ellen White. And it's all about money, all about their power, their position. It's just very sad, when you look at motivations. He's the one who has all the motivations to lie, not me.
Yeah. So let's transition now to the big lies, which is how you brand them in your psychobiography as well as your most recent book. Toward the beginning of the book, you talk about Ellen White's big lie, her lie specifically. What is that big lie? And who all was involved in covering it up?
I mean, the biggest lie, if you're just going to choose the one big lie of Ellen White, is that she was the instrument of God, that everything she wrote was downloaded by the Almighty. I have the 27 quotes of her claims, and that's number one, that she doesn't write a single thing to the church that doesn't come directly from the throne of God. I mean, that it is such a ridiculous lie and such a big lie that everything else, all the other lies she tells, are based on that lie. And that false authority that she claims God gave her. And then to top it off, she acts like she's this humble vessel of clay that could do nothing of herself. It's only if God lifts her up and speaks through her that she can do anything. So everything is about how God is just speaking through her. She basically claims to be the voice of God. She claims to be the spirit of prophecy. She calls herself that. That is a term reserved for God. The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus himself. To call yourself the spirit of prophecy is simple blasphemy. That Adventists can't understand this. And from my very earliest years writing in Adventism, I 100% oppose that. I 100% oppose this remnant lie. So even in my earliest years, if Tim wants to say I did some great about face, he can try to claim that lie. But anyone who studies my writings over my lifetime will see very early, from the very beginning of my work as an Adventist minister, I was 100% critical of Adventist claims of the remnant, of Ellen's claims of being the spirit of prophecy. Adventist claim that was a mark of the remnant church. It's just disgusting. I mean, those were the things I was trying to change while I was in Adventism. And, more and more and more, I just found how completely impossible it was to change a lot of these things.
Yeah. You kind of drill in on it more. Ellen White's big lie, specifically toward the beginning of the book. On page 15, you say this, quote, "After all the false date setting for the second coming of Christ that Ellen had engaged in based on supposed visions, she still managed to insist that Christ was going to return on October 22nd, 1851. So Joseph Bates's 7-year theory. Mm-hmm. This was the basis of her final shut door testimonies listed above, which you listed in the book. When that date also passed in the future, James and Ellen delegated her shut door visions from their writings, and in the future, Ellen would deny ever having such visions. The major problem with Ellen White's claimed visions was that she attributed their content to God. So the big lie that Ellen White was telling became the big lie that God was telling." Close quote. Now, in response to this claim, even though his paper was written before the release of his book, Alberto Tim had this defense in his paper. and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. This will be our final thoughts from Alberto Tim. He writes, quote, surprising as it may sound, Daly has no difficulty in making Ellen White to advocate exactly what she was condemning. In 1850, Joseph Bates published a 16-page pamphlet entitled In Explanation of the Typical and Antitypical Sanctuary by the Scriptures, suggesting that Christ would return 7 years after 1844. That is, in October 1851. In November 1850, White warned, the Lord showed me that time had not been a test since 1844 and that time will never again be a test. In July 1851, she stated in the same tone, the Lord has shown me that the message of the third angel must go, and that it should not be hung on time, for time will never be a test again. I saw there were some that were making everything bend to the time of this next fall, that is, making their calculations in reference to that time. Nonetheless, Daly repeatedly speaks of White as the great promoter of this theory, and even as having been shamefully disappointed by it. Now, that's his own spelling there. But close quote. So, Steve, he claims that Ellen White, before 1851, claimed that time would never again be a test, which proves that she never endorsed any more dates by vision. And this proves that you're supposedly omitting this fact and are in error when you claim this. Is that true?
Absolutely not. I don't know if Tim is just completely superficial in his understanding of things, or again, if he's being deliberately dishonest. It's always hard to tell with the apologist. But when you look at all the quotes, starting with the 1844 Joseph Turner plagiarism, and you just go through all of them, what you find, and certainly, Joseph Bates didn't come up with his 7-year theory till towards the end of that 7-year period. It was 48, I believe, when he wrote the paper, and Ellen endorsed it. And James was less convinced by it, which is very interesting, because even as early as 1849, James was wanting to, broaden out more, do more missions types of things. But Ellen was convinced by Bates that the 7-year theory was correct. And, these two statements that he quotes are have to be understood in the context of everything else she says. Ellen contradicts herself quite often, so the fact that she contradicts herself isn't terribly surprising. But in June 27 of 1850, which is recorded in early writings, page 67, Ellen gives a very specific time prophecy that the newcomers to their movement, and there were only a small number of them, but the newcomers who had joined them only had 3 months, only a few months left before probation closes. This is obviously tied to the 7-year theory. When you read what she writes in early writings, it's all about this terrible time of trouble that's coming. Probation's going to close before the time of trouble starts. Every sin has to be dealt with. You have to be sinless. You won't have an intercessor. This statement that they only had a few months left, that means 3 typically. She's being very specific there. They only have a few months left before it enters this final period where probation will be closed. They won't have any opportunities after that. This is in June of 1850 that she writes this. So why would she write this other thing in November? Well, one very obvious reason would be that things weren't materializing the way she had prophesied. They only had a few months in June, July, August, September at the latest. But there was no close of probation that was perceivable. There was no great time of trouble that could be perceived in any way, shape, or form. So now she's getting a little worried. Hey, why isn't any of my stuff coming true? Which was typical of her stuff. None of that stuff during her 7-year period ever seemed to come true. She got it in the language of Canaan or whatever. But, so she's kind of protecting herself a little bit here with this November comment, but she still goes back to, damning everyone. The shut door is still on. As late as June of 1851, she makes her last shut door pronouncement that the whole world is lost, that no one can be saved from this point forward who has not already been saved, going back to her pre-tribulation, pre-time of trouble perspective. And then it's after that, and I think it was a combination of a bunch of things. Now it's almost October. It's obvious that none of the stuff she's prophesied is even close to coming true. There's no time of trouble. There's no persecution against Adventists. There's none of this stuff that she claimed would happen. So what does she do? She makes this mea culpa, but it's not a mea culpa. She's not admitting she was wrong. She's not admitting that she didn't get any of this stuff from God. She just makes a statement to try to protect herself when October 22 comes. This is like a last-minute effort to try to salvage herself, and I'm sure James had a lot to do with it. He was probably saying, I told you shouldn't have bought that stupid 7-year theory, and he didn't buy it, and so now she's having to claim that God gave it to her, but she has to try to discredit it somehow. I mean, this is just, Tim doesn't understand the complexity here, or he's deliberately lying. I don't know which it is. But if you look at the complexity of it, it's very clear what's going on. It's very clear that Ellen White was deceiving, lying, trying to cover for herself, double speaking out of both sides of her mouth, so that whatever happened in October 22, she could claim, oh, yes, I predicted that. It's just typical Ellen White is what it is.
Steve, I wonder if Ellen accepting the 7-year theory is what resulted in James having to sleep in a different room.
Yeah.
I know that maybe that was the catalyst or the snowball that led to the marital dysfunction, which maybe we'll save that discussion for another time. Jud Lake actually has some interesting defenses on that front. But Tim's claim here really just shows the bias they themselves have, that they claim everyone critical of the movement has. Like you mentioned in your book, that he even criticizes, anyone without a commitment to Adventism that examines the evidence, it's just not defensible, folks. It's not defensible. Any person without a dog in the fight, if you showed them these things, they're going to be able to tell you. I would go so far as to say, like, an 8-year-old would be able to tell you, I don't know. It just goes against common sense. It just, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Okay. But we've heard his name mentioned several times. So question for you, Steve, who was D.M. Canright, and why has the SDA Church sought to destroy him? Because in chapter 2 of your book, you get into the threat of D.M. Canright to the SDA Church. So can you go into that some for the audience?
Yeah, just a brief summary. Canright didn't grow up in a religious home. His dad wasn't religious. His previous ancestors had been, but he grew up on a farm. His dad was civic-minded. He was a great community person, but he wasn't educated. He wasn't high on education. Canright had a real hunger for education. He paid for his own education, took trains, paid for everything, in spite of the fact that his father wasn't supportive of it. And he had no religious background until he came across some Baptists as he was approaching, I think, 18 years old at the time. And they helped him, understand the gospel and accept the gospel. And he was quite excited about that. He had a real passion for the things that they shared with him. But the next year, he got transferred to an Adventist school because of a relative living in New York, it was, I believe. And So for the first time now, he was in an Adventist school, and James and Ellen, this was back in the early days of the movement, 5,000 or less. There weren't that many people in the movement. And so James and Ellen would go right around to the schools and recruit. They were big on recruiting young people that they felt had potential. And they saw a lot of potential in Canright. So they recruited him to live in their home and work for them. And they did the same thing with his brother. They did the same thing with his wife, Lucretia. She was in the White home. She didn't live with them quite the same way that Canright did for the period, but she was there a lot, and Ellen kind of adopted her as a daughter. So they saw the inside of the White's life, the marital stuff, Canright describes. He saw them take all these old books that were worthless that they owned and come up with the idea that, hey, we can get a bunch of money for these by forcing the church to buy these books from us and send them out free to the mission field and all this kind of stuff. So they came up with this clever plan to take all these worthless books that no one wanted and force the church to buy them. And of course, Ellen had visions that God was telling every member to support this work and buy these books. Well, they're personally paying the Whites for these books. And Canright saw this whole thing, and that was kind of one of the early things that really put questions in his mind, along with the hypocrisy on diet and, Ellen and James downing the 200-pound porkers when she's writing her health message that everyone's to be strict vegetarian. And, he sees all the hypocrisy. And yet he has a lot of cognitive dissonance because the Whites have helped him. They've gotten him into the ministry. He's a favorite son. He's given opportunities that the Whites alone were able to give people. So he shot right up the ranks of Adventist ministers. So he owed a lot to the Whites. And at the same time, he saw the hypocrisy. He saw the lies. He saw the financial dishonesty. James was accused of embezzling from the church way back early on. The messenger party, etc., left the church over Ellen's false prophecies, and the shut door, and the James embezzling money from the church, and Ellen was part of that. But Canright had this real double whammy going on where Adventism was everything. It was his whole identity. It was his career. It was his life. His wife was tied to it. They were all tied to the Whites. And then they were seeing more and more of this very troubling stuff that said, how can this be a prophet of God? This is just very troubling, because they were sincere, honest believers and not con artists the way the Whites were. And so then, when they vacationed with him, and Ellen wrote the 25-page letter condemning them after James and Canright had a blow up. They, at that point, they realized, holy Toledo, this woman's she just makes stuff up and attributes it to God. And it comes out of a blow up. So she immediately has God downloading a 25-page letter, which she claims he showed her all this stuff way earlier, but now he was telling her to write it. Yeah, right. It's the bottom line is Canright knew way more about Ellen, her personal life, than any other critic of Ellen White, by far. He was living right in their home. He saw everything firsthand. He was also a brilliant guy. He was the one who represented Adventists in all the major debates when they went up against Miles Grant. Anyone could have done that. Could have been James White, could have been Loughborough, could have been any of them. They all selected Canright. Canright was the one who was considered to be the best defender. He knew Adventist theology better than any other person. And James wasn't even a student. He stole the stuff from the young guys and claimed it was his own, as Canright documents. But, the bottom line was all the other churches knew Canright because he was the one that would debate against them. So this guy has a lot of gravitas. He has a lot of credibility outside Adventism and inside Adventism. So that's the reason he was such an incredible threat, is he had all the personal knowledge of James and Ellen. He witnessed it firsthand. He wasn't relying on rumors or secondhand information. He saw it firsthand. And he was also the spokesman for Adventist teaching and theology, and he understood it better than anyone else in the church. So when he came to realize it's not the true gospel, this isn't really what the Bible teaches, who's going to be more threatening than the person who represented the church to defend them? So he was definitely an extreme threat. There's just absolutely no question about that.
Yeah, and I mean, as you're obviously aware, that's not the picture that's painted of Canright in the SDA Church.
For sure.
You're going to get this sort of, he's an arch heretic. He's a total backstabbing Judas type individual.
Right. Benedict Arnold.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing that's so interesting is, has the SDA Church utilized Alberto Tim's advice regarding fairly representing Canright? The criticisms he was just making against you in that paper, is he utilizing that same standard when it comes to DM Canright? No, they're not. Are you looking at all of the sources? He's saying that, Steve Daly in his book, he may claim that he has 326 sources, but that's only going to impress the uninformed individual. These sorts of statements, they're not using their own standard that they're claiming the critics of Adventism need to use when it comes to their criticisms of Canright. You mentioned a little bit there his relationship to the whites. That's another area that they've sort of tried to rewrite history and twist the facts and say, well, this man had an axe to grind against the whites. He was he was angry at them, etc. Can you speak into that a little bit more? What sort of relationship did he have with the whites on a personal level?
He cut the whites way more slack. People that try to say, I copied D.M. Canright. D.M. Canright never called Ellen White a fraud. D.M. Canright never called Ellen White a con artist. D.M. Canright never came close to criticizing the whites the way I have. And I base it all on what they wrote, what they said, their own source documentation. But Canright loved these people. He wept at her funeral. That was the one thing that was true that Adventists accused him of. But, all the other stuff is just pure lies that he recanted, that he wanted back in, that he said he was a lost man. All the stuff they throw at him is a pure lie. And he wasn't an angry person. He was the one that wanted the truth when he left Adventism. He was the one that said, I'll never say a word about Adventists if you promise not to attack me. But they couldn't resist. They brought all this on themselves. And, back to Tim, the guy is the ultimate hypocrite, because here he accuses me of being biased, not being fair, not using sources correctly, when I'm 100% true to my research question. But then he turns around and writes a book review. What is a book review supposed to do? It's supposed to be fair to the entire book. So his obligation as a book reviewer is to be fair to my entire psychobiography. He doesn't even address the main sources and the main evidence, which is source documented from her own pen, her own life, her and James. It's source documented stuff. It's not me making stuff up. It's not me making accusations apart from the absolute evidence. I mean, it's just unbelievable that he could be such a hypocrite, that when, as a reviewer, he was a 100% failure on the very things that he accuses me of doing, when they didn't apply to me because I was true to my research question. It's almost mind-boggling that a person could be so hypocritical and think you could get away with it. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah. There's a lot I could add, obviously, to that, because again, it just, that paper, I'm when I first read it, I'm thinking, okay, let's hear. I always start any sort of examination of anything they put out, whether it's Jud Lake's book, it's Kevin Paulson at the AD Vindicator, whoever it may be. I always start with the thesis of, okay, what is the criticism? Let's see, where are you addressing it? Where are you addressing the criticism? Okay, still waiting, still waiting, still waiting. And I got through all 6 pages of Mr. Tim's paper. He didn't address a single claim, Steve, that you make in your book.
Right.
You make hundreds of claims in the book, yet the claim, the only defense I ever hear is, that's out of context. Okay, show it, demonstrate it. Let's see it. Okay. But they don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. So it turns into, this person's angry, this person's bitter, this person doesn't know what we actually believe, like they claim about Canright. If Canright was so uninformed about Adventism, he knew nothing about Adventism, like you mentioned, why was he put forth as your representative in public debate? Absolutely. Why were you paying him to travel around on these, what they used to call crusades, going around teaching Adventism, recruiting people to Adventism? Yet, for some reason, when we leave Adventism, there's some sort of, I guess you didn't catch this part about when when you signed on the dotted line in your baptismal vows in Adventism, Steve, you didn't read the fine print clear enough, because there was a clause in there that said once you leave, there's going to be an undownload from all the information in your brain, and you're not going to remember it anymore, the things that you were taught. So anytime that you critique Adventism now, it's because that undownload has happened and you just don't remember anything correctly. It's just laughable. It's laughable. That's not a defense. Deal with the actual claims. You document down this quote from Ellen White regarding Canright. She writes, quote, "God has been pleased to open to me the secrets of the inner life and the hidden sins of his people. The unpleasant duty has been laid upon me to reprove wrongs and to reveal hidden sins. When I have been compelled by the Spirit of God to reprove sins that others did not know existed, it has stirred up the natural feelings in the heart of the unsanctified. While some have humbled their hearts before God, and with repentance and confession have forsaken their sins, others have felt a spirit of hatred rise in their hearts. Their pride has been hurt when their course has been reproved. They entertain the thought that it is Sister White who is hurting them, instead of feeling grateful to God that he has in mercy spoken to them through his humble instrument to show them their dangers and their sins. And they may put them away before it shall be too late for wrongs to be righted." Close quote.
Yeah, that's part of the 25-page letter she wrote.
Yes. What was Ellen White claiming here regarding Canright?
I mean, what's she claiming with regard to the Holy Spirit? First of all, that she's the one that's been appointed to convict sin and reprove sin. John 16:8 tells me that's the Holy Spirit's job. I will send the Holy Spirit to convict of sin and to reprove sin. Here again, Ellen's engaging in gross blasphemy while she calls herself humble. You know, I don't know how a person could be more hypocritical than to call yourself humble when you're engaging in the most base form of blasphemy you could possibly be engaging in. And, this was just the way Ellen operated. Anytime anyone stepped out of line, she was a control freak. And especially someone as threatening as Canright. But even like the elders of the Battle Creek Church, how does she intimidate them and attempt to control them? The Lord gave me a vision showing you left the most sanctifying meeting on the judgment and went back to your rooms and engaged in the base vice of masturbation, and she's telling all these people God showed her a pornographic vision of them masturbating in their rooms. And, it's just, this is a public thing she's doing in the Battle Creek Church. The woman just has no boundaries. I mean, you talk about the most extreme manipulation and exploitation you can possibly do. That's what she did. And that's how she operated. If anyone stepped out of line, here came the boatload of condemnations, and they're all general. I mean, it's just so stupid that for anyone to take her seriously when you know everything that is out there that she wrote is, you just have to say this person needs their brain examined or something.
I mean, it's just like, what a statement. Like, talk about no fear of God. Steve,
right.
Can you imagine ever saying such a thing? We laugh, but it's just because the only other option is to cry.
Absolutely.
I mean, can you imagine yourself, Steve, making such a statement? It's just crazy to think. I've never had a thought to think, God showed me your secret sins. You were, tugging one off in the room after the meeting, or instead of being at the meeting. And there's just so many problems with this. Yeah. There's so many problems with this. And like you said, for any person that knows all of what's out there and has heard all the defense, their favorite one, that was for a specific time. Dancing and chess were associated with, lewd behavior. I know she said not to take a bath on the Sabbath, but you don't realize it was a lot of work. You had to walk down to the river and get water. Right. And it was only a time-based prophecy for a specific period. It was only sinful, in the 1900s, 1800s to take a bath on Saturdays because it was a lot of work. But now that we have modern day plumbing, it doesn't really apply anymore, even though her writings, making no distinction, are a continuing and prophetic source of authority. It's just so many problems. So
I mean, it was problems. A different time. They didn't have John 16:8 then. They didn't have Revelation 19:10 then. They didn't know what blasphemy was then. I mean, come on. The woman is a blasphemer. It doesn't get much worse than that, than grossly misrepresenting God and making God out to be a liar and a fool. I mean, come on. It's just so disgusting that... and the woman got away with it. It's at least Bernie Madoff got caught before he died. Yeah, but Ellen, she's gotten away with it for more than 100 years after she died, and they're trying to cover it up for longer, just like they did with the 1919 Bible Conference minutes. That was the one chance where it looked like the church might actually try to be honest. But no, they had to bury those minutes for more than 50 years. And when they did come out, Arthur White grabbed him and wouldn't allow any church member to see it till he was out of office, and it was leaked by Spectrum to the public. I mean, it's just the way they operate. The White estate is grossly dishonest, and Tim is grossly dishonest, and they won't own it. It's the bottom line.
Well, and that's, Steve, that's why I constantly say on this platform, and I've been saying for over a year now, at least publicly like this, that their favorite, the commandment-keeping church's favorite commandment to break is bearing false witness.
Absolutely.
It's the recurring theme. And it's like, why are you guys like this? Well, because of money, power, and control. That's ultimately what it comes down to. Yeah. So the central focus of your most recent book centers around Carrie Johnson.
Yes.
And her book,
and I was
correct.
Right.
And their book, I guess I should say their book, not her book. Right. I was Canright's secretary.
Right.
Who was Carrie Johnson, and what was her big lie?
Yeah, that was it, that she was Canright's secretary. That was as big a lie as she could possibly tell. Although when you look at her life and even the testimony of her own grandkids, she was a serial pathological liar. That's just what she did. And she was a classic sociopath as well.
Real quick, Steve.
Yeah.
One thing you said there, just because I don't want it to get buried. When you speak about her grandkids, who are you talking about, and why are you referencing them? Because I think one of them has something to do with your book.
Yeah. She's listed as a contributor. Nancy Page is her name. And it's actually because of her that I decided to write the book. When I was doing my daily Facebook thread, she was on, and I got to know her, and I was fascinated that she was Carrie Johnson's granddaughter and was very interested in the things she was saying. So I did an extensive interview with her that I recorded, and I said, there's material here that really needs to be explored and examined, and I think it's worthy of a book. And she was, yeah, great. Others have said it's worthy of a book, but nothing ever happens. But I was serious about it, and she was a great contributor, and her brother, and it was just something that if it hadn't been for them, as I've written many times, if it wasn't for Nancy Page and it wasn't for Norman Douty, I could have never written that book. Those two witnesses were so important and so powerful that the book could not have been written without them. So I owe a great debt of gratitude to both of them. Of course, Douty's no longer with us, but Nancy is. And she was with me on the interview with Peter Dixon on SDA Q&A. But generally speaking, she doesn't like to be out in public. She doesn't consider herself a public speaker particularly. And so I'll do most of the interviews myself. But, her grandmother was a thief. She was kicked out of the Adventist church for stealing church funds. And she was a typical sociopath. She could butter up people that she wanted to impress and get close to, just like Ellen White could. But at the root, at the core, there was evil there, and a mistreatment of her grandkids. She exploited them. She abused them. She was an opportunist, always looking for an opportunity to benefit herself at the expense of others. And she made her grandkids do all the work for an apartment she rented that she got paid for, and she never gave them a cent for painting it and cleaning up all the messes and crap and everything that was involved with that. Nancy goes into detail in the interview. But, she was just a sick person. She really had a major pathology and major dishonesty. And, after all possible witnesses are dead, she comes up with this claim. And I think the reason she came up with it was because she was close to Andrews, and she knew Arthur White came to Andrews, and he was the head of the whole White estate nationally. And she was a clever, conniving kind of person. And she was in Battle Creek a short time, and she'd heard of Canright when she was young. And now she realized, hey, everybody's dead that can possibly testify against this story. So she just completely creates the story, knowing that Arthur White's going to probably want to jump at something like this, because Canright's such a hated person, and his influence was getting greater, not less, with the other churches. This was a period when Adventism were being completely renounced as a cult. So in 1950, she introduces herself to Arthur White and claims she was Canright's secretary. And he goes crazy. Oh, wow. Yeah, we got to get your witness. We got to get your testimony. You got to write a book about this. And, it's a fairly small book. It's something you could write in a year, especially if you're just speaking out of your own personal testimony. But obviously she wasn't. Arthur White could see very quickly that she didn't have the goods. She didn't have the personal experiences. She didn't even know how long she worked for the guy. She claimed different times, 2 years, 18 months, 7 months is what it finally came down to. But those 7 months can be proven to be absolutely false. That Canright wasn't even there. He had his own secretary that was his next door neighbor. There was absolutely no way that she was his secretary. But then the book also proves that there was no way that she ever even met the man. because she claimed to his family and to Douty that she saw that he had a peg leg when she knew him, which was completely false. What she had tried to do was do research on Canright when she came up with this lame brain idea. And she either mixed Canright up with one of his relatives who had a peg leg, or she believed a false rumor that Canright had lost his leg in a hayfield accident when he was a kid, because that's what she told the family. You know, how stupid can you be to tell a man's own family that he had a peg leg when they know that he didn't? And all the neighbors, all the witnesses that Douty brings out in the book all say, you know, she's completely crazy. He had 2 good legs. He worked hard on those legs. The other possibility, which I doubt that this was her confusion, but before he died, Canright had an accident shortly before he died in 1919, and he had to have a leg amputated. But her claim to Canright's family was that he had lost his leg in a hay accident, which was the false rumor that had been spread. And so she simply bought that false rumor and didn't admit where she got it from. She claimed it as fact that she'd actually seen this when she worked for Canright. So, you know, the woman is so discredited in a million different ways. It's like Douty said, she lied when there was no benefit in lying. She just plain couldn't tell the truth. She couldn't speak without misrepresenting the truth, no matter what she was saying. And so she was just a pathological liar. And once Arthur White realized this and realized that Canright didn't have a peg leg and that she was completely deluded and that, you know, she didn't know what she was talking about, he didn't want to let go of the idea, hey, we got Canright here. We have a woman who's willing to claim she was his secretary. So let's run with this and just create the story ourselves. So he meets with her on a regular basis for 20 years and basically tells her what to write. And her grandkids witness this. And so, you know, it's really all about Arthur White. He's really the one who wrote the book. He's really the one who got it published. This is much more about Arthur White than Carrie Johnson, because she's really just a criminal and an evil person that had no standing anywhere. Whereas Arthur White was the head of the White estate. That's quite a big difference. Here you have the head of the White estate stealing a diary, colluding with Carrie Johnson to keep, they both denied ownership so they could keep the diary in the White estate, which is, it's there to this very day. I mean, they're thieves, they're liars, Arthur White should be discredited from every award he was given. He should have the honorary doctorate taken away from Andrews. He should be cut off from the White estate for all the years. He should be discredited as the biographer of his grandmother, all 6 volumes that the church considers the official biography. I mean, this man is an embarrassment. And it's an embarrassment to the White estate that he represented them all those years. And none of them are owning it. You know,
Right.
They want to do the usual. Let's just cover it up and pretend it's not real.
Yeah. Which it's like, it's not 1980 anymore, folks.
Yep.
It's a different era. So who all was involved in I Was Canright's Secretary? You mentioned Carrie Johnson and Arthur White. Was it just those two?
They were the two that put the whole thing together. And no one even knew about Arthur White being involved except for Carrie Johnson and her grandkids. So I'm very thankful that I was able to get the witness of her grandkids before they pass on, because they're getting up in years. So,
well, and you mentioned too the diary, which you talk about this a lot more in depth in the book. But for those in the audience who may not know about that, what exactly was going on with that? Because that's kind of a key link in the whole product actually coming about. They needed that diary in order to bring this whole thing about. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah. Once Arthur realized that Carrie never even met Canright, much less worked for him, He didn't want to let go of the story, but he realizes that Carrie has nothing to offer him except lies. So now he has to try to build a story on filler that he generates. And then he says, but there has to be some kind of personal information here if you actually work for the guy. So you need to get a hold of his diary. And Arthur was aware that he had a diary out there in the family. So he puts Carrie up to going out and meeting with the family members, getting to know them, making them believe that she's writing this great sympathetic biography of Canright and that she loves the guy and she honored him at his grave and he has a street named after him and he was this great, wonderful person and she just wants the whole world to know about it. Never tells them she's coming from the Adventist, never tells them what her true motives are. So she completely lies and deceives them and gets the relatives to allow her to borrow the diary. It was supposed to just be borrowing for a short time so she could go through it and take material that would be helpful to making Canright look like a great man. As soon as she gets her hands on that diary, which she'd been trying to do for some time, Nancy says she was the happiest person in the world. She went straight to Arthur White. This was their deal. She handed it to him. He locked it in the White estate. Douty and the family demanded it back as soon as they realized that they'd been duped and deceived. And Arthur White refused to give it to them. He tried to stonewall them forever. And then he said, well, this isn't our property. It's the property of Johnson. You'll have to talk to her. So then they go to Carrie Johnson and she says, no, I gave it to the White estate. I don't own it anymore. And that's the arrangement that Arthur and Carrie worked out. We'll both deny ownership. Therefore, they can't get the diary back. And it's still in the possession of the White estate today because of that lie, because of that theft. And what they really planned on doing was now we can make up anything and attribute it to Canright's diary because we're the only ones that have access to it. The problem was that Norman Douty was a very shrewd, smart guy, and he insisted on at least being able to read the diary. They wouldn't allow him to take any notes. They wouldn't allow him to make any copies. But just the fact that he read it, he made it clear in his book in 1964 that there was absolutely nothing in that diary that was harmful to Canright. So that really threw a major brick in their plans because they wanted to make up all kinds of lies. And when Carrie Johnson went out on the camp meeting circuit as the big Adventist celebrity, she made up all kinds of lies and attributed them to the diary and stuff. But they weren't in print, so it was a lot harder for people to know about it. But the Adventist audiences were eating it up. There's still one of those interviews on the internet to this day that I have referenced in the book that you can go, and she's just disgusting. I mean, she's saying Canright was completely demon-possessed. He spoke in these demonic voices when he was trying to dictate to her. And I mean, you couldn't be any more asinine than what she is. But she, the Adventists were just eating it up because this is their public enemy number one. He was demon-possessed. He was the exorcist. Oh, wow. No wonder he criticized Ellen White. He was straight from the devil. This kind of stupidity when Canright was actually a man of integrity, an honest man, a sincere man, a lover of God, a believer in the gospel. And Arthur White and Carrie Johnson were the opposite, which Adventism in general tends to be the opposite.
Now, Steve, what the Adventist response, other people will hear that, but what the Adventist response is going to be
to that.
And it's going to be, well, that was Carrie and Arthur or the White estate, not the SDA organization. That's just individuals. Of course, individuals are flawed, etc. How has the SDA Church gone about propagating and promoting this lie? Because has the SDA Church, do they have any blood on their hands when it comes to I was Canright secretary?
Absolutely. That was the greatest book ever for the church. They promoted it like mad. The Review and Herald completely prostituted itself. It didn't even vet the book. It just took Arthur White's word for it. So they would have been subject to such a ridiculous libel suit that you can't even comprehend. And it could have brought down the whole SDA Church, because the whole church was promoting this book, promoting her as a celebrity at all their camp meetings, telling her lies. They were recorded lies that could have stood up in court. They dodged a bullet, basically. The church, Review and Herald, White Estate, it all could have been taken down by the stupidity that Arthur White engaged in. And the Adventist Church is so good at covering things up, and they live in their own little isolated subculture away from the rest of the world, and accountability to the press and all these kinds of things, that they just lie. They lie and they lie and they lie, and they're going to try to lie their way through this in whatever way they can. But the whole church was involved in this, and the book is still being published today. It's unbelievable that they're still promoting this and advertising this as if it's truth, even after my book's already out.
I was just going to say, I still see this promoted. I still see people citing it, etc. So with that in mind, I want to play a small clip of something that you said a couple of years ago in your discussion with Tom Norris, Ellen White Apologist, on the SDA Q&A. Shout out to Peter Dixon if he's watching in the audience. He's going to actually be on in about a month and a half or so. So shout out to him.
Norris is or Peter Dixon is?
What's that?
Did you say Norris is going to be on, or Peter Dixon's going to be on?
No, sorry. Yeah, that's probably confusing. Peter Dixon. I've actually extended the extension to Tom Norris. He has rejected, but that door is still open. Tom, if you want to come on here, if you happen to be watching this, you know what we talked about, and the door is still open on that stuff. But let's listen to this, and then I'll have a question for you afterward.
Okay. Not relying on Canright at all.
You said that on your website. You admitted it, and I've quoted it in my book. So what you're saying now is not even true. Your whole book is Canright.
That's a complete joke. There's nowhere in my book where I talked about relying on Canright, nor did I rely on Canright.
You say you like Canright. You think he's a great guy.
I do think Canright was grossly misjudged and condemned by Ellen in ways that simply won't stand up to what was fair and honest. And Douty's book is a great book. I don't know if you've read it. I don't know if you take Carrie Johnson's book, I Was Canright's Secretary, seriously, but if you do, I feel sorry for you. And you're going to feel sorry for yourself when the evidence comes out on that.
I suggest you read what Peter's going to post up and look at the sources.
Peter can post it up. Fine. I'm glad to look at what you've put up. But the bottom line is that I've put 326 heavily, extensively documented sources, and you haven't refuted anything, so it's.
Well, no one's asked me to. I can easily refute everything you're saying. And I have, and it's been written. You just haven't seen it yet.
Okay, well, that's an easy thing to say.
Wow.
So
I've seen that. I've seen that clip. Well, a bunch since I clipped it out for this, but I've watched that discussion probably 5 or 6 times, just as an analysis of Ellen White apologetics and the sort of claims that are just made that it's just par for the course. But Tom was accusing you of being a Canright parrot regarding your book on the Ellen White psychobiography. Again, we've seen that made by Mr. Alberto Tim. You also mentioned your 326 sources that Alberto Tim dismissed, as well as Carrie Johnson's phony book. What we saw from Tom, folks, was the standard response that we get from Adventist apologists, that everything you claim has been refuted. It's all easily refuted. You haven't even read the materials. You haven't even seen this, that sort of thing. So my question for you, Steve, what are some of the strongest evidences that Carrie Johnson never even knew Canright? You mentioned some of those earlier, but then also, it's a two-parter. Now that the evidence has been published in your book, what are some of those evidences? Because Tom says they've all been answered. And this was, again, a couple years ago before your book was published. But now that it's published, what are some of the strongest evidences that Carrie Johnson never even knew Canright?
Number one is the peg leg. I mean, that's just a completely ridiculous claim, and really a very stupid claim. She didn't need to make that claim, and if she hadn't made that claim, it would be a lot harder to prove that she never even met Canright. But, it's one thing if you said, well, this guy actually had two good legs when he had a peg leg, because, person could add an artificial leg and hit it well or something. But when you're claiming they have a peg leg when they have two good legs, that's completely ridiculous. And everyone knew it was ridiculous. Arthur White knew it was ridiculous. That's why it wasn't included in the book, because it was discredited by the whole family, by everyone who knew Canright. Carrie Johnson just made a complete fool of herself by making that claim, number one. So that's the most important claim she made that proves that she never even met the guy, much less worked for him. Then there's not a shred of evidence, as Nancy points out. Nothing, not one piece of evidence to show that she ever knew Canright or worked for him. Every single thing she claims about going to the secretarial college, it wasn't a college. The guy's dead that could have confirmed it. Nancy says she saw the manuscript of Carrie's writing. She was completely unskilled, had no secretarial skills at all. She just lied constantly, as Douty said. She was a pathological serial liar and a thief. And anyone who takes her seriously, Arthur White wasn't even taking her seriously. He just realized, hey, here's a person willing to prostitute herself and claim she was Canright's secretary. We have to take advantage of this and make the best of it and see how much mileage we can get out of it, which is precisely what he did and what the Adventist Church did. Of course, the church didn't understand that it was a fabrication. Arthur White understood that it was a fabrication. So Arthur and Carrie were the only two who knew it was a fabrication. But Douty pretty much knew it was a fabrication. And, he wasn't a wealthy person, and he wasn't in a position. He was threatened with lawsuits when his book came out in 1964. He didn't have the money to defend himself against a whole denomination of lawyers. So he took the book off the market. It's an unfair fight when you have a whole denomination of lawyers going up against a person who's not at all wealthy and not in a position to pay for lawyers. So, Douty really could have hurt them bad if they hadn't used such intimidation tactics and went after him and went after Canright's family, threatening lawsuits and all this stuff, which was just the way Adventists behave. They bully anytime they can bully to control. If that's the only resort they have, they'll definitely bully. And so, the easier question to ask is, what evidence is there that she ever met Canright or worked for him? And that would be zero. There's absolutely zero evidence, whereas there's absolutely overwhelming evidence. The day she claimed Canright met with her for the first time was the day his wife died. He was miles away. It was a snowstorm. There was no possible way he left it 4 a.m. to meet with her when his wife had just died. I mean, every single thing you go through on this is an obvious lie. It's not even questionable. So, people confront her, well, how come there's not even a secretarial pad or anything that you can produce? Well, it was all burned in a fire. Oh, well, why did you have that stuff when you claimed that you had given it all to the Adventist leaders? Why would they give it back to you when Canright was such a threat to them? They would have at least made copies of something. I mean, there's just no common sense here. It's every single thing she claimed won't stand up to facts, history, common sense, any kind of honesty or integrity. I mean, it's just a complete joke that this woman was ever taken seriously. And now anyone who takes Arthur White seriously is guilty of the same thing, because Arthur White is just as implicated in this whole thing as Carrie Johnson was.
So were you ever able to look over Tom's supposed responses that just completely destroy everything that you have to say?
Yeah, that was another lie. He kept saying he was going to get it to me. He was going to get it to Peter. He never did. The document didn't exist.
He never even shared it? No.
Someone said that he put something up on the internet, but then took it back down. But, Tom is not a serious person. You might say, well, why did you agree to debate with him? He's a very boisterous, obnoxious, braggadocious type of person. And he gets on the internet and he makes all these claims. And, Daly's afraid to debate me. I've tried to get him to debate me and he refuses. He's afraid of me. So I finally said, I'm going to shut this guy up. He's so disgusting. So I go on. You can hardly get a word edgewise in when you listen to the debate. He's just this obnoxious, ridiculous person. And now he's going around claiming that he won the debate. Every single person that listened to it or saw it that I'm aware of said he did nothing but embarrass himself. He was just a complete joke. And that's really what he is. He's not a scholar. He has no credentials. He has no credibility. It's really funny. I've had a lot of great real estate people I've worked with in my life, so I don't have anything against real estate people, but I've never had a real estate person tell me they know more about theology and history and psychology than I do. But that's what this guy does. He seems to know more about everything than anyone. And it's just, he's not worth taking seriously. I would encourage you not even to have him on your show if he agreed to do it, because the guy's an embarrassment to himself and an embarrassment to apologists. Even apologists recognize that he's a joke.
Yeah, and the only reason I extended it was because he was popping off in a group that I'm in on Facebook
all the time,
calling me a liar, saying I didn't know what I was talking about. And so I said, all right, come on to Answering Adventism and let's let an audience see who's done their homework, who actually can back up there, because I'm not the kid cheating off of my neighbor and their homework and then trying to turn it in. Yeah, I have told people from the beginning, I didn't start this hastily. I started Answering Adventism after a decade removed from Adventism, sitting under sound, qualified pastors and elders, studying SDA systematic theology, etc. And I stand by the homework of this platform. Am I above error? Of course not. Of course I could make errors somewhere. But if you think I'm in error, come onto the platform and let's do it. Well, and then he started singing a different tune. So I don't think he'll actually be on, but that was the only reason that was actually extended. Now, you've mentioned a number of times tonight, as well as in that previous clip, the name Norman Douty.
Yeah.
Who was Norman Douty, and how does his book fit into this whole thing?
Norman Douty was a person who had an interest in Adventism even before he wrote the case for D.M. Canright. But he got to know Arthur White when he was doing research on Adventism. And then Arthur White was making statements about Canright that were very derogatory, just echoing. He said, "Oh, I have testimony from his secretary that Canright recanted and, repented, and that he said he was a lost man over and over and over again and only wished he could come back to Adventism, but knew he was a lost man." And I mean, all the crap that Carrie Johnson claimed. And Douty knew better. And so, he started pressing the subject, and Arthur White got quite uncomfortable, realizing this guy's got a lot more gravitas than I do. And he's actually a very great researcher, very, very skillful, careful person who wrote a great book, The Case for D.M. Canright. It's the best book on Canright's life. And it was just really well done. And he also documented, even though they were threatening him with a lawsuit if he mentioned Arthur's name or Carrie's name, he still referred to a woman claiming to be Canright's secretary and basically spilled the beans on her in a way where she couldn't sue him or something. And but they still, intimidated him so much that the book got taken off the market. So it wasn't on the market for very long, but then it's had a resurgence of popularity, here in the 21st century. Now the book is free, available online, and I encourage anyone who has an interest in Adventism to read it. Surprisingly, a lot of Adventist scholars have never heard of Douty or read his book. I was interested when I was talking to John Butler, who's a friend of mine recently, and asked him about what he thought of Douty's book, and he said he hadn't heard of it or read it. So, he's a top Ellen White scholar. It just shows you how people get kind of focused in their areas of research. And just because a person has a PhD doesn't mean they know everything about that subject. It's simply not true. The more you focus in on a specific question, then you learn a lot about that one question, but you don't know everything about it,
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question to you because, again, I don't think a good sample of this because I was just kind of a laity, etc. But for someone like you who worked in, academia, SDA academia, did you ever hear about Norman Douty?
I never heard about him in any of my classes. I had numerous classes in Adventist history and my master's degree on that. At the seminary, at my undergraduate training, there was a great history department there. Douty's name was never mentioned. There is one footnote in Schwartz's book, Light Bearers to the Remnant, that just mentions Douty, but he was never mentioned in class. It's like Adventists are completely ignorant of who Douty is. And I didn't really get into reading Douty till I wrote the psychobiography. As I was doing research for the psychobiography, then of course I was going into the critics of Adventism in great depth, and Douty's name became important at that point. But I found it on my own. I studied him on my own, and most Adventists seem grossly ignorant of who he was and what he wrote.
Why do you think that amongst the critics, he's a name that's not or hardly ever mentioned? Surely not like a Dale Ratzlaff, a Walter Ray, a Desmond Ford. Why is Douty the name that's only ever sprinkled in? So, for example, in Jud Lake's book, he mentions Douty's name and the name of Douty's book. He doesn't touch anything that Douty actually says in his book. Yet he does at least try to appeal to things Canright says, as we're going to see momentarily. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that they don't treat Douty the same way that they do Canright and the others?
For for the definite reason that Douty is not a direct threat to Ellen White the way most of the critics that they're worried about. I think one reason they're so worried about me and they're trying to silence me and censor me in every way they possibly can is because I was in Adventist academia for 24 years. I wrote the book Adventism for a New Generation, which was used as a textbook in Adventist colleges and universities for years. So, I'm a licensed psychologist. I have major academic works in history as well as theology. And so they're really threatened by that. If it's a Ratzlaff, they'll say, oh, he was a high school teacher or something. But it's a lot harder for them to dismiss me. I have the goods on them a lot more. And I'm a researcher who has strong academic credentials and understand research more than probably any of them, because I'm trained in research at a level that none of them are trained in. So, I think Douty was not a threat to Ellen White directly. He was a threat to their attempt to discredit Canright, but they got his book off the market, so no Adventists even heard of him. So, they weren't worried about Douty because he was not an Adventist, and he had really no exposure to Adventists, and Adventists were even taught if it's not an Adventist, don't read it. So it's almost impossible to find Adventists who've even heard of Douty, much less read him.
Yeah, that was definitely the experience that I had. But again, I don't think I'm necessarily a good sample on that. But even post, leaving Adventism, where I've done the most of my digging and my reading of, the Adventist, BRI articles and their apologists and those sorts of things, you hardly ever see any sort of, long-winded response or dealing with Douty the same way that you do other critics. But with that in mind, I want to look at what Dr. Jud Lake states regarding Canright in his criticisms, and then I want to get your thoughts. So notice what he writes. He says, quote, just before Canright left the Adventist church, he heard Butler and Smith, talking about G.I. Butler, appeal to Ellen White for an authoritative word on the law in Galatians 3. But he wasn't at the 1888 General Conference session when she turned the attention to the she turned the attention to the delegates back to the Bible and away from her writings as the final word on any biblical subject. Furthermore, she spelled out the final authority of the Bible in 1889, where she said, the testimonies are not to belittle the word of God, she explained, but to exalt it and attract minds to it, that the beautiful simplicity of truth may impress all. Canright failed to notice these words. Thus, in his campaign against Seventh-day Adventism, Canright was fighting pre-1888 Adventism, not the Adventism that has moved on to greater understanding of God's plan for humankind. His criticisms were focused on what he remembered. His charges may have been true of pockets of Adventism, but the denomination as a whole had outgrown them. Close quote. So he claims that Canright's criticisms are essentially invalid because they are levied at an Adventism that no longer exists and has grown past the things that Canright claimed about them, namely the charges that he made about their central focus being on the law and not Christ, as well as Ellen White openly stating that the Bible is the ultimate authority in Adventism and not Ellen's own writings. That all supposedly changed at the 1888 General Conference, and Canright just wasn't tuned into these changes. That's why he was ill-informed. So, Steve, was 1888 really this big turning point in Adventism that completely neutralizes any of the criticisms regarding Adventism being legalistic? Because they love to still use this defense today. For example, they'll levy this at the stuff I say all the time, that you're attacking an old Adventism that's just not around anymore. That's pre-1888, righteousness by faith Adventism. What say you?
Gross ignorance on the part of most Adventists about 1888, including Lake. Lake teaches homiletics. Is that what he teaches, or does he also claim to be a systematic theologian? What are his claims?
He's a professor of preaching.
Preaching, yeah. Okay, homiletics. Okay, that's what he acts like. That's what he writes like. Homileticians are not known for being scholars, and he clearly doesn't strike me as a scholar by the ignorance that seems quite pervasive when he talks about 1888. He seems to have no comprehension of, he'll take her 1901 statement at the General Conference, which I used to quote too, never quote my words again, go with the Bible alone. That's a typical apologist thing for Ellen White if they don't want to try to defend the visions and all the garbage that's attached to her. But the bottom line is that even those statements from the 1901 General Conference session where she addressed the delegates before, she had even her own motivations there. She'd been in Australia for 10 years. She'd been colluding with Daniels. They had their big plan about how they were going to come back and take over the church. And she was going to get back all these people who sent her to Australia. Besides that, Anna Rice Phillips was a prophetess who was gaining great momentum in Adventism at that time. She came into major prominence after the 1888 conference, and she was embraced by Wagner and Jones. She was embraced by Prescott. She was embraced by Haskell. A number of the top leaders in the church felt like she was a true prophet, in contrast to how Ellen White was operating. And I would agree. I think Anna Rice Phillips met the role of a New Testament prophet, that she was actually a legitimate prophetic person in the context of the New Covenant and the New Testament, which Ellen White wasn't by any stretch. I don't care how you try to argue. And so Ellen comes back, and Anna's getting all this attention and all this following. So now, don't pay attention to prophecy. Just go by the Bible and the Bible alone. Ellen White already had her authority and status. She already had all these books out. And when you talk about 1888, Adventists are so ignorant about this, it really troubles me. But you really have to go back to 1854 and study what was happening at that time. J.H. Wagner, who was, E.J. Wagner's father, he wrote a book called The Law of God. And it's the closest thing to true gospel ever written by an official Adventist. He understood that the law in Romans and Galatians was not the ceremonial law, as Adventists claimed, but it was the full law. It was the full Old Covenant law. That you can't be under grace, you can't be under the perfect finished work of Christ and under the Old Covenant law at the same time. It's an impossibility. It's a gross mixture that's completely unhealthy theology, which is where Adventists have always been. Of course, early on, they were just gross perfectionists and legalists. And you have to understand that James White and Bates came out of the most legalistic and unorthodox. I mean, this was the Christian Connection movement that they came out of was absolute heresy. They didn't believe in the Trinity. They didn't believe Jesus was God. I mean, they were completely heretical. And Ellen never challenged her husband or Bates on these views while they were alive. She was just remarkably silent on their anti-Trinitarianism and denying Jesus as God. And she went right along with their gross perfectionism and legalism. J.H. Wagner was trying to break all this in 1854, but everyone was against him. Smith was against him. James was against him. All the other top leaders were against him. Ellen White saw that they were against him, so she claimed to have a vision that his book was wrong, and they all jumped on that bandwagon and banned his book, didn't allow it to be published after that. And Wagner's son, J.H. Wagner's son, E.J. Wagner, worked for him at the Signs of the Times, and him and Jones were running the Signs of the Times before 1888. They were the bigwigs. They were the ones writing the editorials and everything. And they started writing the very same thing that J.H. Wagner had written back in 1854. And Smith and G.I. Butler went insane because they said, hey, Ellen White has already debunked this and already shown that this is heresy. And here they are writing this in the Signs of the Times, a church paper. So Smith is writing all his editorials in the review, fighting against them. And they're having this open warfare in the church papers. And Ellen gets really pissed. And she says, we're looking like fools. You know, our papers are fighting against each other. And so she told them all to shut up, basically. And she said, you know, Smith and Butler are right. They're bringing up my vision, and that was my vision. So they're right. But I want all of you to shut up, basically, and quit fighting with each other. So as soon as she says they're right to Butler and Smith, they go crazy and they publish, Ellen White has endorsed us. We're right. She said we're right based on her visions from God. And Wagner and Jones are wrong. And Ellen just gets totally angry. She just feels totally betrayed that Butler writes a whole book on the subject and Smith is writing editorials like mad. So she's really fit to be tied. And she's so angry at Smith and Butler that she says, I think Wagner and Jones need to be able to speak at the 1888 General Conference because you guys went back on the agreement that you weren't going to continue this fight. So, you know, anyway, then she sees how popular Wagner and Jones are, but she never embraces the message of Wagner and Jones. That's where most Adventists who try to claim that Ellen White became this great gospel advocate are wrong. Ellen White never embraced what Wagner and Jones were saying about the law. And that was their whole topic at the 1888 conference, the law of God in Romans and Galatians. That was their topic. That's what they spoke on every day. It was all that we're not, you know, the Adventist teaching that we're under it's the ceremonial law that's being talked about in Romans and Galatians. That's wrong. It was the moral law. It was the old covenant law. It was the whole law. It was the whole law of condemnation. That's what they were teaching. And Ellen would not embrace that because it wiped out the fourth commandment. It wiped out their claim to be the remnant and all this kind of stuff. So she just latched on to certain aspects of righteousness by faith and justification by faith that were very popular with the people. And she ran with that, getting visions of writing new books like Steps to Christ. And oh boy, look at all the money that can come in with Desire of Ages. And, you know, which is precisely what she did with this stuff. She had a whole new series of books that came out on the life of Christ, etc., all based on Wagner and Jones and the popularity they had in the church. But, you know, she lost an incredible amount of credibility also because because Butler and Smith were saying, holy Toledo, she completely contradicted her own visions. She completely contradicted what she just said beforehand that Wagner and Jones were wrong. Now she's saying they're right. Now she's saying they're the third angel's message in verity. I mean, it's just typical Ellen White flip-flopping for popular appeal and because the masses were turned on to Wagner and Jones. So she wipes out Butler and Smith. Smith even has to step down his Review and Herald and go under A.T. Jones. And Butler gets kicked out of the presidency. And, you know, but Ellen loses a lot in that. A lot of church leaders are saying, holy Toledo, this woman is dangerous. She's a control freak. She's willing to contradict her own visions for political reasons. And so let's get her the heck out of here because the plagiarism stuff was all coming out right at that same time in the secular press in 1889. So they ship her off to Australia, and she never forgets it. She's quite resentful of that and makes it very clear that she didn't want to go. So she comes back with a vendetta to get rid of the GC presidents and the people in office and power, and she puts Daniels in, and then they become colluding buddies up until her death. And then Daniels knows that, I didn't bring up the fact that I think that was one of your other questions, that Willie White knew good and well that Ellen's visions weren't what the church claimed them to be. Daniels knew that too. Almost everyone who knew Ellen White well knew that her visions were nothing like what the church was claiming. They were claiming God spoke to her, gives her all this detailed information. Willie, when he trains Fanny Bolton, says, no, the visions are nothing like that. There's no words, there's no details. She gets kind of these panoramic pictures, and that's all there is to it. That's all the visions are. And then, of course, he didn't say that she filled them in with all the plagiarisms and all the stuff she was getting from other authors. But I don't believe she got anything from God personally. Willie at least was claiming that he believed that she got these kind of panoramic views. But, who knows what she dreamed? She was such this was a woman who had an extreme desire to be somebody, and very unusual, the amount of drive and willfulness she had, and control and desire for power. And I'm sure her dreams were informed by that. And of course, she just made stuff up all the time too, like she did with the 25-page letter against Canrights. But anyway, I don't want to ramble too much, but there's
a lot of good there. I just find it interesting because as I'm reading Dr. Lake's book, again, it's kind of the same thing I was thinking regarding Alberto Tim's paper. It's, do you just lack complete self-awareness?
Yeah.
The same thing you're criticizing others of doing, which in Dr. Lake's case, in his book, and even as a student, I talked with him about this numerous times, specifically regarding health message stuff. The constant criticism was, well, no, you're taking that out of context. He's a huge, well, what's the context? The one he loves to appeal to is to say, when people say that Ellen White said, you shouldn't say I'm saved, you have to understand the context. That was just refuting the heresy of once saved, always saved. She wasn't saying that, the other one they love to use. No. Ellen White claimed she never claimed to be a prophet. She said, I don't claim to be a prophet. Yet you go and read the quote, and in the very next paragraph, she says, because the reason why, and it's because the work she's doing is far more than a prophet. The name it says the exact
enough for her.
Yeah, I consider myself to be the Lord's messenger with direct messages, for the people of God. So she's saying the exact opposite of what they cite the quote for. They quote it to say, well, no, she was downplaying herself, when no, she was totally upswinging herself.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm more than a prophet. I am the Holy Spirit, because I convict sin and reprove of sin. I'm also the testimony of Jesus, because I am the spirit of prophecy. I mean,
and if you go against the shut door, you're insulting the Spirit of God.
Right. Absolutely.
It was blasphemy against the Holy Spirit at that time. It was present truth that you had to go along with this.
Absolutely.
So I want to transition here into the figures involved in the cover-up at the White estate, namely Arthur and Willie White. You just mentioned Willie White here recently. On page 10 of the book, you write this. For the first 63 years of its existence, the White estate's day-to-day operations were controlled by Ellen White's son, Willie, and her grandson, Arthur. Both men were painfully aware that their positions were the product of nepotism and did their best to put forward a front of objectivity. But it was only a facade. In Willie's case, he was fully aware that the nature of his mother's so-called visions was nothing like what the prophetess had claimed and the church had been taught. Close quote. So you just mentioned this in passing.
Yeah.
Can you expound on this a little bit more for the audience? Are you saying that there is evidence that shows Arthur and Willie White were involved in upholding that Ellen was someone that she was not?
Absolutely. I mean, Willie White, in his training of, and of course, Doris Robinson was with him. Doris was a male, Dores, and he was the grandson-in-law of Ellen White, so he was in the nepotism world too. But when they trained Fanny Bolton, who was kind of naive about things, she had been converted to Adventism, and she was all an Ellen White worshiper. She was way more serious about Ellen White stuff than Ellen was, as far as all her stuff. But she was a strict vegetarian, ovo-lacto vegetarian, etc. And Ellen was down in the 200-pound porkers. But anyway, when they get her back to California and start training her, they don't want her thinking what the church members in general think about the visions. They have to help her realize, hey, that's not what you're going to run into here. She gets these quotes, panoramic general views. It's the way he describes it is it's almost a joke, like something she might dream at night or something. Nothing to do with God downloading all this information that they claim in the 2000 visions and stuff, where she's writing out page after page that God supposedly dictates to her. I mean, Willie's very candid about that. No, it's nothing like that. And yet that's exactly what the church was taught and what they believed. So right off the bat, Fanny was exposed to the fact that, holy Toledo, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. And then all the plagiarism and everything starts coming in after that. And it's not surprising that both Mary and Fanny were at their wits' end trying to work for Ellen, given what she was pulling off. But the more they knew, the worse it got for them. And of course, Ellen then turns on them and does everything she can to basically destroy, especially Fanny, because Fanny was willing to talk about things, and you just couldn't do that if you were part of Ellen's inner circle. But my own bias is that Willie certainly knew, and Arthur no doubt knew, because he was living in the home with Willie. He was his son. He heard all the discussions. He knew what was going on. He inherited the White estate from his father. So whatever Willie knew and believed, Arthur would have known. And all we have to do is look at Arthur in this last book to see that he's the most Machiavellian kind of personality imaginable.
Just a scumbag.
Yeah, absolute scumbag.
That's just the succinct way to put it.
Yeah.
For those in the audience that may not know, you've mentioned this a couple times, and it's kind of a perfect segue from cover-ups. Question for you. What was the 1919 Bible Conference, and why was it such a big deal?
Yeah, it was such a big deal because it was really the first time in Adventist history where the church was trying to grapple with the truth. And Daniels and Prescott and all these people knew the truth, that Ellen wasn't who she'd claimed to be. She wasn't who the church had been told she was. They felt like now she's dead, so we can deal with this stuff in a way that can maybe salvage some kind of healthy perspective and not just keep reinforcing the same lies and mythologies and pathology. And most of the people at the 1919 Bible Conference were on the same wavelength, but you had Washburn and a few others there who swore to secrecy. They would respect the confidentiality, but it was a total lie again. They had no intention of respecting the confidentiality of the conference, and they were seething with anger because they were a small minority of people, and they realized, holy Toledo, all the major leadership, including the GC president and everyone, knows Ellen was a plagiarist. They They know she was basically claiming to be something she wasn't, and that the church was believing she was something she wasn't. And boy, we got to get rid of all these people. So they go out and immediately violate the confidentiality they'd sworn to and start sending out all these papers to church members saying that Daniels needs to be fired, and all these people. They just basically conducted a purge. And sure enough, Daniels was out at the next GC. All his Prescott, all these people that had been close to him were out. They put in the most reactionary. The next 30 years of Adventism was what I call the real dark ages of Adventism, even worse than when Ellen White was alive, because you had the apologists just taking over, the lies just taking over. The 1919 transcript should have gone in the White estate. They are the ones that oversee that kind of information. But instead, they buried them in the GC archives, knowing that no one would know where they were. No one would know where to find them. And sure enough, people gradually die off, and no one knows anything about them. They disappear. They become as if they never were. And it's not until 1974 when someone asked Donald Yost about what was the conference that took place in 1919, and he starts going through the whole GC archives and finds these transcripts that were purposely hidden and purposely forgotten by these reactionaries who took over the church and wanted no part of any kind of honesty. And during that 30-year period, you had the most Andreasen, F.D. Nichol. You talk about Ellen White apologists. I mean, these are people that buy into her perfectionism, buy into Jesus the model man theory. They take the very worst of Ellen White, and they, when Lake tries to claim Adventism became this great thing after 1888, he's either grossly ignorant or grossly dishonest. I don't know which it is. But anybody who knows Adventist history knows that this 30-year period between 1920 and 1950 was about as terrible as it can get in terms of Adventist apologetics and lies and honoring Ellen White and elevating Ellen White in ways that were completely untenable. They believed a lie. That's all there is to it. And that was really, for them, the wonderful age of Adventism, that it was growing based on all their perfectionistic lies, all their remnant lies, all their EGW lies. So, I mean, the 1919 Bible conference was the last gasp where the church had a hope for becoming honest. And it got squelched and smashed and stepped on by the apologists. And it's never really recovered from that. Once those transcripts were discovered, then you had numbers, then you had, the whole Glacier View thing with Ford, then you had Ray, and then you had the internet kind of exploding. Then you've got my books, and all this stuff is all post 1974 when those transcripts were uncovered. But, it's, I don't know what Lake's smoking when he tries to act like post 1888 is this wonderful Adventism. Anything the opposite is true, especially after 1919 Bible conference.
And not just that, but he's talking about how F.D. Nichol, has silenced all, all these critics and all this stuff. Man, F.D. Nichol is like well past 1888.
Oh,
and
yeah.
he's still dealing with criticisms that you're claiming are pre-1888 criticisms, which is why Canright's criticisms are supposedly invalid. But regarding Ellen White's plagiarism, I want to look at a common defense given by SDAs by way of hearing it from their scholars and academics. So again, referring to Dr. Jud Lake, in his book, this is what he writes, quote, "For those like Canright who espouse a more rigid view of inspiration, Ellen White's literary borrowing poses a special problem. If God gave her the exact words, they argue, why would she need to use the words of uninspired writers to express the divine revelation? Inspired writers get all their information directly from God, so they don't need to borrow expressions from the writings of other human beings. This understanding of inspiration doesn't take into account the literary borrowing done by the writers of the Bible. As noted below, the Bible is replete with literary borrowing as well as many other modes of divine human communication. Ellen White's use of literary borrowing to express the content of her visions was no different from the practice of the biblical writers. They often used literary borrowing to express the divine truths given to them through revelation, and this biblical practice is best explained with the whole person model of inspiration that takes into account both divine guidance and human participation. Close quote. So you've obviously heard this defense before, Steve. It is a common one that they give to defend Ellen White. They claim that since the biblical writers engaged in plagiarism themselves, it shouldn't be used against Ellen White. What are your thoughts on that defense?
It's just really sad. It's hard to believe that a person claiming to be a scholar would even write those words. But anyone who understands anything about biblical literature, and especially the times in which the Bible, was written, people don't understand that. I would expect any scholar to know this, but, the average person doesn't understand that the Bible of those ancient times did not have chapters and it didn't have verses. There was no way of referring to Romans 6:14. None of that existed. It was a completely different period. Most people didn't even have access to the scripts, to the manuscripts. And the scholars, the Pharisees, the rabbis, they had the scriptures memorized word for word. Jesus knew the scriptures word for word. Paul knew the scriptures word for word. It was completely understood. Even the people had a verbal knowledge of scripture that goes way beyond anything we can comprehend today, because oral traditions and people didn't have printing and writing the way they do, in the post-Reformation period. And so people memorize the Bible. Even the common believer often memorized most of scripture, but not near to the degree that the rabbis and the Pharisees and these people did. To accuse Jesus of plagiarism when he quotes from the Old Testament, if he doesn't give a reference or something, is just absolute nonsense. A person who would make this kind of equation to Ellen White is either smoking dope or being deliberately deceitful, because all the Bible writers who quoted from other Bible writers knew exactly what was going on. There was no mystery here. There was no deceit here. There was no attempt to hide where they were getting this stuff. It was just completely known. And there you're still talking about inspired writers from inspired writers. But that doesn't account for Ellen White borrowing from a bunch of people who write things that are completely imbecilic. Vital force physiology and all the crazy stuff Ellen White writes that she gets from other writers that no Adventist would try to say came from God today. I mean, it's just so ridiculous that I get really annoyed when someone of Lake's stature makes this kind of an argument. It just causes me to lose what little respect I may have had for him.
And these other authors that they love to appeal to, they didn't take these things from other people, copyright it, and then make a bunch of money off of it.
Right. Precisely.
And then get really mad when they're deported to Australia, like you said earlier, and their royalty is cut while they're gone. and they get fuming mad when their royalty amount gets cut.
She demands the highest royalties while other people aren't even taking royalties. And,
right.
She's saying it's not me, it's God. Oh, but I sure want these royalties. I mean, everything about her is problematic.
And I know I got this stuff from other people, but no one's going to do the same to me because I'm copyrighting it.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Precisely.
So we've mentioned him a couple times. You talk about him a little bit in your book, Francis Nichol, F.D. Nichol, and his influence within Adventism. Many Adventists, I don't think, are even aware of his influence on them as modern day SDAs. But you write this. You say, quote, much of what Nichol wrote was intended to offset and refute the very damning criticisms that D.M. Canright had leveled against Ellen, which were gaining a great deal of traction with the churches condemned by Adventism in the 5 decades after Ellen's death, as we shall see in the next chapter. So in the eyes of SDAs, Nichol was the primary dragon slayer of these churches and the champion defender of Ellen White during this period. So my question to you is, what role has Francis Nichol played in covering up Ellen's big lie?
A big role. You know, he became the champion spokesperson for Ellen. As I said, he mentored Arthur. He was much brighter and much more educated than Arthur or Willie or any of these other apologists. He was the super apologist. Plus, he was a very bright guy. He got this fame from being in these debates with Shipley in San Francisco that were covered in national newspapers. So he became the young superstar of Adventism. And then he put his mind to apologetics. And it was all about defending Ellen White. And this is that 30-year period of darkness where Ellen White becomes God. And it's largely because of Nichol. You know, Nichol's just promoting her at every turn and claiming that he can debunk any critic who's ever thought of anything that could possibly be termed negative about Ellen White. And so Nichol was a huge factor. You know, even when I was growing up, F.D. Nichol was super famous. His books were super promoted and well used in the Adventist church. I heard about Nichol very young. And, you know, I didn't come to realize that the guy was a fraud for many years. But it doesn't really matter if it's racism or shut door or whatever it is, you'll find him using the same apologetic lies and cover-ups for Ellen and he became the standard bearer for that. Most of like the apologists on my thread who say dumb things get them from Nichol. They're just parroting Nichol much of the time because Nichol obviously studied this stuff way more than they have done. But
yeah, I mean, he's like the poster child for any sort of Adventist apologetics.
Absolutely.
We did a stream a few months ago dealing with Ellen White's racism. Yeah. And we dealt with actual historical sources, you know, quotes from Snook, you know, B.F. Snook and people that were in high places of leadership back then, showing they all universally understood the amalgamation statements. Absolutely. And it wasn't the repositioning that Nichol tried to say, well, you know, it's talking about being unequally yoked.
Right.
You know, these sorts of twisting defenses. No, they all understood what she said. That everyone believed the same thing until Nichol sort of, you know, he was sent on the hunt to do a specific thing to find a ghost. So he found a ghost.
Right.
That type thing. And when he was sent out on a mission to do this specific thing that the SDA Apologist is then bringing to us, well, no duh. He was sent out to do that specific thing. And the defense that he's giving is not a valid defense. But these are the people that they're going to point to say, well, this person's already dealt with all of it. And if you don't actually mention them in your book, like you didn't talk about him apparently enough in your book, Steve, it's because you're too scared of the sort of things that he's put forth. When in reality, like you pointed out, no, it's just irrelevant to what's being said because it doesn't actually deal with any of the valid criticisms.
Precisely.
So I want to look at another quote here from Jud Lake, only because it gives us another sort of, example to use to launch into the next question. This is from his analysis of the testimony of Dirk Anderson. I don't know if you know who that is. He runs non-SDA.org. Notice what he says.
Dirk Anderson wrote the foreword to this last book.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry. And notice what he says regarding Francis Nichol and Canright, though, in this analysis of Dirk Anderson's testimony. He says, quote, "I can only wonder what he," talking about Dirk, "did when he came across F.D. Nichols, Ellen White, and her critics. Did he read through this book carefully, or did he put it aside thinking it couldn't refute Canright? I don't know, but it is interesting that on his website and in his books, he rarely mentions Nichols' massive apologetic and never seriously engages its contents. In fact, most contemporary critics of Ellen White rarely engage with Nichols' answers to Canright's charges. Why? Because Nichols' work, although dated in some places, provides a thorough refutation of Canright." Close quote. So we get a glimpse into the sort of attitude that SDAs and SDA academia have for Francis Nichol. I hear them parrot him constantly, like I said, and their scholars will write stuff like this. But Steve, we would be included in the contemporary critics of Ellen White camp, and he claims that modern critics don't engage with F.D. Nichols' defenses of Ellen White, where we get a pretty good example of what you refer to as him being seen as the untouchable dragon slayer. What are your thoughts after hearing a statement like that?
I just, again, feel sorry for Lake that he's that naive. But, he may not even be aware that Nichols' arguments are completely outdated and dishonest. Much more than being outdated, they're dishonest. He completely misrepresents the evidence of the shut door. He completely misrepresents the evidence of amalgamation of man and beast. It's completely obvious to anyone who knows anything about Adventist history. We know exactly what happened. Ellen made the statements referring to the black race, and there was a complete uproar in the church. This was Civil War times. People were just going insane that she could say something like that. And then there were others that were racist that were all turned on that she had said this. Uriah Smith saw that this was a huge problem, so he took it upon himself to be the ultimate apologist and write this whole pamphlet trying to bail Ellen out. And the way he tried to bail her out was to say that the amalgamation of man and beast was, yes, indeed, precisely what she meant, human beings and animals reproducing, but it wasn't the, quotes, black race in America that the Civil War was about to be fought over. No, this was various tribes in Africa and New Guinea. And I mean, it's just complete stupidity that, that would just be isolated to these various tribes that also happen to be black people. But, the bottom line is that Ellen and James...
Well, don't forget, Steve, it wasn't only those overseas. It was even the tribes here, the Digger Indians in America.
Yes. Yeah, precisely, which I wanted to mention. But the bottom line is that, Uriah wrote this. Ellen and James endorsed it. They took it to camp meetings and they sold it like mad. That this was the explanation for what Ellen had written. So it makes Nichol out to be a complete nitwit fool that he's claiming that she meant something entirely different when she specifically endorsed what Smith said and said that was the explanation to get her out of the hot water that she was about ready to melt in. I mean,
the defense on that is just so lousy, Steve. It to me is just, when I get on that topic, again, folks, you can go watch that stream. We went deep on this. I just have such a short patience on that, because that's exactly it. And I did a video on this talking about this, about they put their stamp of approval on Uriah Smith's paper where they went out and sold this thing at camp meetings, where he's talking about the example of what she means by amalgamation is people like the Hottentot tribes, the Digger Indians of the North Americas, etc. And says, could anyone even disagree? He says in there, could anyone disagree when looking at them and think That's how God intended people to be. He says that, doesn't he?
Yes.
He says no thinking person could look at these people and think, no, God didn't intend it to be that way. They're like a lower subspecies of human that's kind of like hard to label. That's what was being said. And the defense to it is, well, no. Ellen White never verbatim directly said that she supported that. Oh, she just went and sold it around at camp meetings. And James White does have a statement publicly on it where he says, I reviewed it and I approve what is in this pamphlet. So he does. Ellen clearly, even if she didn't know, Steve, the fact that you're going around selling a book that you don't know that something like that is in there, I have no patience for that. It's absolutely despicable that you would defend something like that. It's nasty. That didn't come from God. The other defense that, she was just talking about, again, this like relegated, it was a sin for a specific period of time, even if you're saying it's mixed marriages. So it was sinful for a specific period of time. And SDAs will say, well, what advice would you have given during that time? Hold up a second. So what is a sin and what isn't a sin is dictated by the current like American climate. The people that abolished slavery that led the charge were Christians. You're saying those people, well, it would have stirred things up at the time. So did abolitionists. This idea that, it was sinful during that time to have a mixed marriage. Why? Well, they'd be relegated to a life of misery. Says who? Well, at that time, you have to, again, it's relegating something to be a sin for a specific period of time. It just creates more problems. That doesn't solve the issue. It just creates more problems.
What it really shows is that Nichol was just a very dishonest person. He was smart. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew the history, but he deliberately lied and covered it up and made it something that he knew it wasn't, to try to bail Ellen out. And I have just no respect for that.
Exactly. Another example of this is what Jud Lake claims regarding Dale Ratzlaff. So again, using the same tactic they always use, DM Canright, Dirk Anderson, now Dale Ratzlaff. At the beginning of his critique, he recognizes that Dale was a fourth generation SDA who received all of his formal education from Adventist institutions. He graduated from the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary, pastored 2 SDA churches, and was a Bible teacher in their school for many years. He recognizes all of that. But despite all of this, the charge is made that Dale is ignorant of what SDAs believe and teach. Notice what he writes. Quote, "There's an interesting parallel between Ratzlaff and Canright." This sounds familiar, doesn't it, Steve? Didn't we just read a quote earlier where we saw, we should do a parallel between Steve Daly and Canright. Here we go again. As demonstrated in the previous chapter, Canright, like many of his fellow ministers, never really grasped the fact that Ellen White taught salvation by faith alone in Christ and resisted an overemphasis on the law. He was a product of the pre-1888 legalistic Adventism, and when confronted with the facts regarding the true nature of the law in relationship to the gospel, he found it incompatible with his understanding of Adventism. Rather than embrace the concept of law and gospel working together, resigned from the Adventist ministry and left the church. Consequently, he missed the intensity and clarity of expression with which Ellen wrote on the relationship of justification by faith and the law during the years following 1888. In a similar way, Dale Ratzlaff never seemed to fully understand Ellen White's teaching on salvation. Since leaving the SDA Church in the early 1980s, Mr. Ratzlaff has never interacted with the studies related to the centennial of 1888, which set forth the profound impact this message had on the church and Ellen White. The theme of salvation through Christ's merits is clearly evident in Ellen White's writings. It balances her statements that discourage people saying, "I am saved." This statement, by the way, must be interpreted in light of its immediate context, something that Mr. Ratzlaff never understood as an Adventist and continues to ignore in his treatment of Ellen White. Close quote. So we see the recurring defense from them of saying that critics are all ill-informed, they don't actually understand Adventism, they haven't engaged any of the copious amounts of works that they've put out dealing with the criticisms, etc. They've said it about you, Steve, Canright, and basically anyone else that leaves and is critical. Question: do you find it odd? And I'm really curious about this because of your background in psychology as well. Do you find it odd that they make these charges about individuals who were taught Adventism from Adventist professors and theologians that then went on to teach and preach in their own institutions? What does that say about their teachers? These people know nothing about Adventism, yet we paid them and they held positions of teaching Adventism within our institutions for decades.
Yeah, I'm sure the party line would be, oh, Ratzlaff, he became a Fordite, and, he got contaminated right after Glacier View, like so many of those young ministers that left the church. And, the superficiality of these people's thinking is almost unworthy of addressing. It's so poor. But I always have to ask myself the question, how much of it is gross ignorance on their part, and how much of it is deliberate dishonesty? And I never know for sure, which side of the scale is tipping there. But what I do know for sure is that Adventists have never understood the perfect finished work of Jesus Christ. The closest I ever saw in two individuals, one historically was J.H. Wagner, which is son, E.J. Wagner and Jones were very close to him. But Ellen White did not embrace what they taught. Adventists in general did not embrace what they taught. At the very best, Adventists have always been a mixture of law and grace, which Scripture doesn't allow for. There can be no mixture of being under law and under grace at the same time. You're either under law or you're under grace. The Old Covenant law is the law of sin and death, Romans 8:1 and 2. We're under the law of the Spirit as God's people under the New Covenant, which all the principles that you can find in the everlasting covenant has always contained God's principles. And David's a good example of how even in Old Testament times, a person could transcend the Old Covenant and live under the everlasting covenant. That's why David puts the ark out for everyone to worship before. That's why he has 24/7 musicians playing around the ark. Anyone who knows the Old Covenant law knows that that was the death penalty. No one could go into the ark. It was only to be in the most holy place. Only the high priest could go in once a year with a rope tied around his leg. If he was unqualified, he got yanked out dead. David puts everyone, including the Gentiles in the camp, before the ark. It's the most flagrant, complete violation of the Old Covenant law that you could possibly do. And he does the same thing with his soldiers, feeding them the showbread that belonged to the priests alone. That was the death penalty for doing that under the Old Covenant law. David was a man after God's own heart. He was a man functioning under the everlasting covenant, which is the same as the law of the Spirit. It's the same as the new covenant, which is new only because Christ revealed the everlasting covenant as it had never been revealed before. That's why it's called new, not because it wasn't around before. The everlasting covenant was always around. But Adventism must, they must honor the Old Covenant law because that's where their fourth commandment is. And, 2 Corinthians 3:7-9 makes it clear that that's a ministry of death and condemnation. Adventists don't know their Bible. They've never known their Bible. J.H. Wagner had it right. The only other person that found it on his own was Brinsmead. When I was at the seminary, 1978, I loved reading Verdict and Present Truth, Brinsmead's two magazines. He understood that we're not under the Old Covenant law. He taught, that's where I came to understand it for the first time, the true gospel, the true perfect finished work of Christ, how all these things fit together in Scripture. Adventists have never understood them. They've never come close to understanding them. At the very best, they've had a mixture, which is double-mindedness and the combining of the hot water of God's grace with the cold water of human works, which God spits and vomits out of his mouth. So, my guess is that Lake doesn't have a clue what the true gospel is. And he certainly doesn't have a clue about Adventist history as I listen to him.
Yeah, and he totally misrepresents Canright. You're talking about the Adventist view on the law, and there's going to be a lot more content in the coming weeks. Actually, at the turn of the year, we're going to be diving into this a lot more, because that's exactly it, Steve. Adventism just does not have a grasp on covenant theology at all. It's just a total botch. The idea is that the new covenant is basically a do-over of the old covenant, but not really, because Jesus basically gives you an extended probation, and then you keep trying, but like you're not fully there yet. And so then you're confessing your sins to be transferred to the sanctuary, and then you have a clean slate again, but you're growing in grace, and you're eventually trying to get to a point where you're sinlessly perfect now, so you can stand before God without an intercessor. Yeah. That's not what the old covenant was like either. You break it once, you're disqualified. Absolutely. I hate to break it to you, Adventist. You're disqualified. You're disqualified. That's what Steve is trying to get at. Not that people just, because they hear you say that, Steve, and they're going to think you're saying then we can just commit adultery. And it's like, man, you're not getting it. You're not getting it, because that's not what you're advocating for. What you're trying to explain is that what was a ministry of death, and the whole point of that, like you were saying, was to ultimately point people to Christ. That wasn't some unique thing to 2,000 years ago, as though David and Abraham, and I mean, when Paul wants to point to the gospel, who does he point to? He points to Abraham. He uses Abraham as an example in Romans 4 to talk about the exact same gospel that you and I are affirming. Well, I'm not sure Jud Lake has actually read Canright on with the same level of focus and diligence that he thinks needs to be done with people like F.D. Nichol when it comes to people like you and I. Because notice what Canright says in Seventh-day Adventism Renounced regarding his view of the law. Right. Because again, the claim is essentially like, well, just like Ratzlaff, they just, instead of recognizing how the law and the gospel actually really function together, they just completely threw the law out and they just left and abandoned Adventism altogether. Notice, folks, this is what D.M. Canright himself says. He says, quote, this is from Seventh-day Adventism Renounced, page 305 and 6. He says, quote, antinomianism, from anti, meaning against, and nomos, law, against law, is a term applied to those who maintain that Christians are under no obligation to keep the law of God or to do any good works. If they commit any kind of sin, it will not hinder their salvation at all if they only believe in Jesus. Salvation is wholly of faith without any regard to a man's deeds. See any encyclopedia. This is an abominable doctrine, subversive to the gospel, yet Seventh-day Adventists brand all as antinomians who do not agree with them as to what the law of God is.
Right.
I am as much opposed to antinomianism as they do. I believe in strict obedience to law, in keeping the commandments of God, and in the necessity of good works as strongly as they do. Luther vehemently opposed antinomianism and yet taught the abolition of the Mosaic law. It is unfair and unjust for Adventists to call people antinomians who abhor that doctrine being antinomianism. Close quote.
Absolutely.
Does that sound at all like what Jud Lake claimed? No, it doesn't. Because Canright's issue wasn't with the law of God. His issue was with Adventism's unlawful use of the law of God and how the law was to be defined. So I'm not sure Dr. Lake has actually read Canright as thoroughly as he expects the critics of Adventism to read Adventist scholars. But we also see from Lake's statement how, again, anytime someone points out their legalism as it pertains to the law, they claim that it's an old criticism that was dealt with in 1888 and it's no longer valid regarding modern-day Seventh-day Adventism. Canright was spot on when he claimed that anyone who disagreed with them gets accused of being an antinomian. That hasn't changed one bit. I hear it constantly. I deal with hundreds of SDAs, or engage with hundreds of SDAs every week, Steve. This comes up at least 10 times a week, at least.
Yeah.
This charge is always brought up. So if you disagree, it's the false dilemma fallacy. There's only two options, like a false dichotomy. It's either
Right.
you agree with us or you're this thing over here.
Right.
When it's like, well, no, there could be a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh option. But no, it's always this false dilemma. Now, I don't want to spill, this will be my final question here. I don't want to spill all the beans on the entirety of your book. So this will be the last question. In the final chapter of the book, you talk about why this book is important and you give 10 reasons. One of which is that the SDA Church has been dishonest regarding Ellen White. I want to look at one more statement as an example of such and get your thoughts. And it's actually the dedication of Jud Lake's book. So at the very beginning of the book, here's what he says in his dedication of the book. Quote, "To Ellen White, who remained true to her prophetic calling in spite of the scorn of her critics, and left a legacy of writings faithful to the Lord Jesus Christ and his word, the Bible." Close quote. So obviously, Ellen White apologists like Jud Lake have a very different picture that they paint regarding her and her legacy. What would you say to any Adventists out there that have only ever heard the sort of whitewashing of Ellen White, where she's often painted as, the humble, dedicated servant of God who overcame all sorts of fiery arrows from angry critics and demonized people like D.M. Canright, despite her writings just being so Jesus-focused and all of the other claims that they love to make to paint her as some sort of saint? What would you say to that Adventist that's only ever heard that, posturing?
All I can do is encourage them to read my psychobiography, look at the sources, look at the source documentation, do the same with the White estate fraud, and then notice the lifelong patterns. We're not talking about David committing adultery here. The lifelong patterns of dishonesty, fraud, pathology, cover-up, control, manipulation, exploitation, false testimonies condemning many people that were proven to be false. There was no question that they were false, that she simply made these testimonies up. False claims for herself, false claims of speaking for God on all kinds of subjects that clearly God did not speak on. Racism, God hating various children, and ultimately blasphemy. When Ellen claims to be the one who convicts of sin and reproves sin, that is the Holy Spirit's job in the New Testament. Ellen is a liar and a fraud and a blasphemer, and she claims to be the spirit of prophecy, which is the testimony of Jesus. And if you insult her, you insult the Holy Spirit. This is stuff that is just too ridiculous in terms of lifelong patterns for a person who claims to be the humble servant of God. People can study and read for themselves, but to me, the evidence is so overwhelming that it's just pitiful that these apologists keep clinging to their lies.
Yeah. Steve, thank you for being here. I know it was a long evening. I appreciate your time. Maybe we can have you back sometime in the future to maybe camp out on one thing in particular. But I definitely recommend his book. Obviously, folks, please consider picking this book up. It's on Amazon.
Yes.
It's pretty easy read.
And if they haven't read the psychobiography, this one should be read first.
Definitely. Because this one I can see how it segues very nicely off of a lot of the material that's already covered in that book. So, Steve, any final words that you'd like to tell people where they can find any sort of this stuff, if it's even an option to engage with you online, whatever it may be? Any final words that you have?
Yeah, my thread on Facebook is open to the whole public. I've got 5,000 friends, so if you want to, that's the limit. So if you want to become a friend, put your name on the list. And if anyone drops out, I'll try to include you. But I don't make any money from my books. I've written 28 books. It all goes to charity. So the accusations that I write for money are false. And I just want to have people pursue truth and honestly weigh the evidence for themselves. That's what I always say to my church members. Don't take my word for it. Test all things and hold fast to what is good based on a Christ-centered, Spirit-led understanding of God's word. So, the perfect finished work of Christ is the most important thing to me in life. And people who think I'm obsessed with Ellen White are wrong. But I do think Jesus made it clear that we are to beware of false prophets. And Scripture makes it clear that we are to test all things, including the spirits. And so I don't apologize for doing that. And I've heard from so many people on my thread about what a great difference it has made in their lives. And so I definitely believe it's a ministry of God that he called me to. And I don't apologize at all for praying about it when I was writing the book. Oh, and
Amen.
I will say, you're one of the best hosts. I've never seen a host who did his homework as much as you have. And I've been on 30 or 40 different interviews. So I'm very impressed with your work as an interviewer and a host. Thank you.
Well, thank
Miles,
you
for all you do.
Absolutely. Folks, I appreciate that a lot, Steve. I'm going to let you go and I'll do our outro here. You've been a treat. And like I said, maybe we'll have you back sometime. So thank you so much for that. There you go, folks. Adventists. You just, sometimes it's hard to, you feel like you're just kind of beating a dead horse. Like Steve said, we're not just here to grind an axe. There's better things that we could be doing than just obsessing over something like this. Scripture's clear. Jesus gave instruction. Paul gives instruction. Peter gives instruction. Beware of false prophets. Check this stuff against the scriptures. The Adventist Church loves to be, or claim to be, the commandment-keeping church. Remember, the 9th commandment. Folks, this is the SDA Church's favorite commandment to break. It wasn't just Ellen White that did this. It's all sorts of people that are associated with this organization. We only scratched the surface tonight. You can read Steve's book and see how this is still impacting real people, real families today. 2023. Today. This stuff matters. And we're a little bit more fiery here. I've said that from the beginning. Everyone's not called to be that same way, and I'm not saying everyone else needs to be that same way. But on this platform, we're going to name names when they're making public statements like this, and they are publicly lying about people. Not cool with that. Nope. And you shouldn't be either if you really love the commandments. Because it's wrong. It's wrong. They've outright lied about Steve Daly, as well as numerous other people, as we saw. But they've outright lied about him by name, misrepresented him, claimed that his scholarship is remedial. Who cares about the 326, actual primary source documents? Those are only, appealing to the not so informed individual. No, not cool. Not cool. Not going to fly. We're going to keep doing streams like this and try and contact other people as well. People that they've made these sorts of claims about, so people can actually hear, like the Proverbs say, Proverbs 18. You need to hear both sides of a matter before you hear a person's opinion. SDAs love to sling that. SDA Apologists love to sling that verse at this platform as if I stand opposed to that. We're constantly talking about, like what Steve just said. Go check the sources for yourself. We don't hide any of them. They're always cited at the bottom of the slides. They're cited in the description of videos. Go check it out yourself. The purpose of tonight was for you to be able to hear and see and weigh the evidence yourself. If you're an Adventist, it's time to get serious about this. This is not some tertiary issue. This is a life and death issue. This stuff matters. It matters. And the SDA Church does not understand the gospel. That's what it ultimately boils down to. You've got all this cover up. You've got all this collusion. You've got all this stuff going on behind the scenes to cover for Ellen White and to keep the cash cow alive, because that's really what it's ultimately about, is power, control, greed. But at the root of all of that is a false gospel. It's a false Christ. It's a false God. They claim to be the commandment-keeping church. They have a false God, which means you're violating all four of the first commandments, the first four commandments. Because if you have a false God, you can't keep the other three commandments because they all four pertain to God. And if you have the false God, you don't even keep all four of them. Your favorite one, the fourth commandment, you're not even keeping it because you guys don't understand the gospel. The spirit of the law is something much deeper than the simple letter of the law. And Adventism is like a modern day Israel in the sense that old school Israel, meaning, oh yeah, we can keep the law. We have the help of the Holy Spirit now. Jesus essentially gave us a do-over. This sort of what Steve was talking about in passing earlier, the model man theory. Jesus being this great example. No, friend. No, you don't get it. You don't get it. So it's time to get serious about these things. Please go and pick up his book. It's fantastic. Seriously, it's fantastic. And pick up the psychobiography as well. It's also fantastic. And look at the resources yourself. He cites everything in there, in the bibliography, as well as in the appendixes, and everything's in the back. All the notes, and you can access it all online. Go start fact-checking Steve, and go and check out and see if what he's claiming is anything like these SDA scholars are claiming about him. He's not unique. He's just the most recent, at least that I'm aware of, person that has the target on them, because like a Canright or whoever had some sort of level of academia or notoriety, if you will, whatever it may be, within the organization. And now that they're actually spilling that information out there, they have to do these sort of hit pieces. No, not going to happen. Not going to happen. If you've been here the whole stream, God bless you. Thank you for being here. Hopefully it was beneficial to you. Hopefully it was educational. Like I said, maybe we'll get Steve back sometime. We will be back next week. TBD, possibly. Should be back next week. We're going to be getting back into our response to John Lomacang on apostate Protestantism, and they claim that the SDA Church are the true Protestants that are really holding the line, if you will. Yet no. And then the week after that, we will be getting into a full stream dedicated to Jud Lake, some other claims from his book, but more specifically a video presentation that he gave that's essentially an overview of his book. So we will engage with some of that as well. And then some Christmas content as well. So buckle up for that. That should be pretty fun. So all that to say, God bless you guys. Thank you for being here. And as always, until next time, God bless.